Hello. I know I'm a little bit tardy getting this started, but I had to get my coffee, so this is a long essay. I'm hoping that Sherry and Judd will join me soon, and so they can take turns reading because it's quite long. I decided to share this today because it's one of the things that I am always constantly linking, and it was I found it at a time that it was like very important to me, and it made a big impact on me, and I just wanted to share it. Let me go ahead and share my screen so that people can see the text as I read. I'll move my mic. All right.
Nate, you have no sound. I'm not trying to insert myself into your show, but no one can hear you.
Yeah, you know what? I can hear me now. You should be able to hear me now, right?
Yes.
Okay. So what happened was when I moved my mic, I bumped the button. I didn't realize I turned it off. Oh boy. All right, great. So
I'm going to go away now.
Oh boy. Well, so much for that. That's hilarious. Okay. Well, let me take it from, let me take it from the top. Sorry about that. Thank you, Luke, for letting me know that I had no sound. What a wonderful beginning. All right. Okay. So the essay is Christ and Nothing by David Bentley Hart. It appeared in First Things in October of 2003. I didn't encounter it until 2015, but it was a very important thing for me when I did encounter it because it challenged me exactly where I needed to be challenged at the time. So, with that said, I'm going to dive in. As modern men and women, to the degree that we are modern, we believe in nothing. That is not to say, I hasten to add, that we do not believe in anything. I mean rather that we hold an unshakable, if often unconscious, faith in the nothing, or in nothingness as such. It is this in which we place our trust, upon which we venture our souls and unto which we project the values by which we measure the meaningfulness of our lives. Or to phrase the matter more simply and starkly, our religion is one of very comfortable nihilism. This may seem a somewhat apocalyptic note to sound, at least without any warning or emollient prelude, but I believe I am saying nothing not almost tediously obvious. We live in an age whose chief moral value has been determined by overwhelming consensus to be the absolute liberty of personal volition, the power of each of us to choose what he believes he or she wants, needs, or must possess. Our culturally most persuasive models of human freedom are unambiguously voluntarist in a rather debased and degraded way.
Nate.
Yes, hey, Sherry.
Good morning.
Good morning.
No one can hear you on YouTube.
Yeah, Luke said he could hear me. You can't hear me. You can't hear me. You can hear me. Like Luke came in and told me, and I turned on the mic. People should be able to hear me now.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe I missed that.
Yeah. No. Luke came to the rescue.
Okay. I'll go away now.
No. Don't go away. Don't go away. You can help me reading.
Well, no, I can't. I gotta.
Oh. Okay.
I gotta brush my hair.
All right, Sherry. See you in a bit.
Okay. See you in a bit.
Okay. All right. Promethean, the will, we believe, is sovereign because unpremised, free because spontaneous, and this is the highest good. And a society that believes this must, at least implicitly, embrace and subtly advocate a very particular moral metaphysics. The unreality of any value higher than choice, or any transcendent good ordering desire towards a higher end. Desire is free to propose, seize, accept, or reject, want or not want, but not to obey. Society must thus be secured against the intrusions of the good, or of God, so that its citizens may determine their own lives by the choices they make from a universe of morally indifferent but variably desirable ends, unencumbered by any prior grammar of obligation or value. In America, we call this the wall of separation. Hence the liberties that permit one to purchase lavender bedclothes, to gaze fervently at pornography, to become a Unitarian, to market popular celebrations of brutal violence, or destroy one's unborn child are all equally intrinsically good because all are expressions of an inalienable freedom of choice. But of course, the will determines itself only in and through such choices, free from any prevenient natural order, that it too is in itself nothing. And so, at the end of modernity, each of us who is true to the times stands facing not God or the gods or the good beyond beings, but an abyss over which presides the empty and inviolable authority of the individual will, whose impulses and decisions are their own moral index. That is not to say that sentimental barbarians that we are, we not still invite moral and religious constraints upon our actions. None but the most demonic, demented, or adolescent among us genuinely desires to live in a world purged of visible boundaries and hospitable shelters. Thus, this man may not elect to buy a particular vehicle because he considers himself an environmentalist, or a woman may choose not to have an abortion midway through her second trimester because the fetus at that point in its gestation seems to her too fully formed, and she personally would feel it wrong about terminating it. But this merely illustrates my point. We take as given the individual's right not merely to obey or defy the moral law, but to choose which moral standards to adopt, which values to uphold, which fashion or piety to wear, and with what accessories. Even our ethics are achievements of will. And the same is true of those custom-fitted spiritualities, New Age, occult, pantheist, Wiccan, or what have you, by which many of us now divert ourselves from the quotidian dreariness of our lives. These gods of the boutique can come from anywhere. Native North American religion, the Indian subcontinent, some pre-Raphaelite grove shrouded in Celtic twilight, cunning purveyors of otherworldly quartz, pages drawn at random from Robert Graves, Aldous Huxley, Carl Jung, or that redoubtable old Aryan, Joseph Campbell. But where such gods inevitably come to rest are not so much divine hierarchies as ornamental étagères, where their principal office would be to provide symbolic representations of the dreamier sides of their votaries' personalities. The triviality of this sort of devotion, its want of dogma or discipline, its tendency to find its divinities not in glades and grottos but in gift shops, make it obvious that this is no reversion to pre-Christian polytheism. It is rather a thoroughly modern religion whose burlesque gods command neither reverence nor dread nor love nor belief. They are no more than the masks worn by that same spontaneity of will that is the one unrivaled demiurge who rules this age and alone bids its spirits come and go. Which brings me at last to my topic. I am the Lord thy God, says the first commandment. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. For Israel, this was the first and foremost demand of fidelity, by which God bound his people to himself, even if in later years it became also a proclamation to the nations. To Christians, however, the commandment came through, and so was indissolubly bound to Christ. As such, it was not simply a prohibition of foreign cults, but a call to arms, an assault upon the antique order of the heavens, a declaration of war upon the gods. All the world was to be evangelized and baptized, all idols torn down, all worship given over to the one God who, in these latter days, had sent his Son into the world for our salvation. It was a long and sometimes terrible conflict, occasionally exacting a fearful price in martyrs' blood. But it was, by any just estimate, a victory. The temples of Zeus and Isis alike were finally deserted. Both the paean and the dithyramb ceased to be sung. Altars were bereft of their sacrifices. The sibyls fell silent. And ultimately, all the glory, nobility, and cruelty of the ancient world lay supine at the feet of Christ the Conqueror. Nor for early Christians was this mere metaphor. When a Gentile convert stood in the baptistry on Easter's Eve, before descending naked into the waters, turned to the west to renounce the devil and the devil's ministers, he was rejecting, and in fact reviling, the gods in bondage to whom he had languished all his life. And when he turned to the east to confess Christ, he was entrusting himself, the invincible hero who had plundered hell of its captives, overthrown death, subdued the powers of the air, and had been raised the Lord of history. Life for the early church was spiritual warfare, and no baptized Christian could doubt how great a transformation of the self and the world it was to consent to serve no other God than him whom Christ revealed. We are still at war, of course, but the situation of the church has materially altered. And I suspect that by comparison, the burden the first commandment lays upon us today, the defeat of the ancient pantheon and the elemental spirits and the demons lurking behind them will prove to have been sublimely easy. For as I say, we moderns believe in nothing. The nothingness of the will, miraculously giving itself form by mastering the nothingness of the world. The gods, at least, were real, if distorted imitations of the mysterium tremendum, and so could inspire something like holy dread, or occasionally holy love. They were brutes, obviously, but often also benign despots, and all of us, I think, in the secret corners of our souls, where we are all monarchists, can appreciate a good despot, if he is sufficiently dashing and mysterious and able to strike an attractive balance between capricious wrath and serene benevolence. Certainly the Olympians had panache, and a terrible beauty whose disappearance from the world was a bereavement to obdurately devout pagans. Moreover, in their objectivity and supremacy over their worshippers, the gods gave the church enemies with whom it could come to grips. Perhaps they were just so many gaudy veils and ornate brocades drawn across the abyss of night, death, and nature, but they had distinct shapes and established cults, and when their mysteries were abandoned, so were they. How, though, to make war on nothingness, on the abyss itself, denuded of mythic allure? It seems to me much easier to convince a man that he is enthralled to demons and offer him manumission than to convince him that he is a slave to himself and a prisoner to his own will. Here is a god more elusive, protean, and indomitable than either Apollo or Dionysus. And whether he manifests himself in some demonic titanism of the will, like the mass delirium of the Third Reich, or simply in the mesmeric banality of consumer culture, his throne has been set in the very hearts of those he enslaves. And it is this God, I think, against whom the first commandment calls us now to struggle. There is, however, a complication even to this. As Christians, we are glad to assert that the commandment to have no other God, when allied to the gospel, liberated us from the divine ancien regime, or that the same commandment must be proclaimed again to if modern persons are to be rescued from the superstitions of our age. But there is another, more uncomfortable assertion we should be willing to make, that humanity could not have passed from the devotions of antiquity to those of modernity but for the force of Christianity in history. And so, as a matter of historical fact, Christianity, with its cry of no other God, is in part responsible for the nihilism of our culture. The gospel shook the ancient world to its foundations, indeed, tore down the heavens, and so helped to bring us to the ruin of the present moment. The word nihilism has a complex history in modern philosophy, but I use it in a sense largely determined by Nietzsche and Heidegger, both of whom not only diagnosed modernity as nihilism, but saw Christianity as complicit in its genesis. Both, it seems to me, were penetratingly correct in some respects, if disastrously wrong in most, and both raise questions that we Christians ignore at our peril. Nietzsche's case was the cruder of the two, but in some ways the more perspicacious. For him, modernity is simply the final phase of the disease called Christianity. Whereas the genius of the Greeks, so the story goes, was to gaze without illusion into the chaos and terror of the world and respond not with fear or resignation, but with affirmation and supreme artistry, they were able to do this only on account of their nobility, which means their ruthless willingness to discriminate between the good, that is, the strength, exuberance, bravery, generosity, and harshness of the aristocratic spirit, and the bad, the weakness, debility, timorousness, and vindictive resentfulness of the slavish mind. And this same standard, noble wisdom, for want of a better term, was the foundation and mortar of Roman civilization. Christianity, however, was a slave revolt in morality. The cunning of the weak triumphed over the nobility of the strong. The resentment of the many converted the pride of the few into self-torturing guilt. The higher man's distinction between the good and the bad was replaced by the lesser man's spiteful distinction between good and evil. And the tragic wisdom of the Greeks sank beneath the flood of Christianity's pity and pusillanimity. This revolt, joined to an ascetic and sterile devotion to positive fact, would ultimately slay even God. And as a result, we have now entered the age of the last men, whom Nietzsche depicts in terms too close for comfort to the banality, conformity, and self-indulgence of modern mass culture. Heidegger's tale is not as catastrophic, and so emphasizes less Christianity's novelty than its continuity with nihilism implicit in all Western thought, at least from the time of Plato, which Nietzsche, in his way, also acknowledged. Nihilism, says Heidegger, is born in a forgetfulness of the mystery of being, and in the attempt to capture and master being in artifacts of reason, the chief example, and indeed the prototype of every subsequent apostasy from a true ontology, being Plato's ideas. Scandalously, to oversimplify his argument, it is, says Heidegger, the history of this nihilistic impulse to reducing being to an object of the intellect, subject to the will, that has brought us, at last, to the age of technology, for which reality is just so many quanta of power, the world a representation of consciousness, and the earth a mere reserve awaiting exploitation. Technological mastery has become our highest ideal, and our only real model of truth. Christianity, for its part, is not so much a new thing as a prolonged episode within the greater history of nihilism, notable chiefly for having brought part of history's logic to its consummation by having invented the metaphysical God, the form of all forms, who grounds all being in himself as absolute efficient cause, and he personifies that cause as total power and will. From this God, in the fullness of time, would be born the modern subject who has usurped God's place. I hope I will be excused for both so cursory a précis and for the mild perversity that causes me to see some merit in both these stories. Heidegger seems to me obviously correct in regarding modernity's nihilism as the fruition of seeds sown in pagan soil. And Nietzsche also correct to call attention to Christianity's shocking, and for the antique order of noble values, irreparably catastrophic novelty. But neither grasps why he was correct. For indeed, Christianity was complicit in the death of antiquity and in the birth of modernity, not because it was an accomplice to the latter, but because it alone in the history of the West was a rejection of and an alternative to nihilism's despair, violence, and idolatry of power. As such, Christianity shattered the imposing and enchanting facade behind which nihilism once hid, and thereby inadvertently called it forth into the open. I am speaking, impressionistically I grant, of something pervasive in the ethos of European antiquity, which I would call a kind of glorious sadness. The great Indo-European mythos from which Western culture sprang was chiefly one of sacrifice. It understood the cosmos as a closed system, a finite totality within which the gods and mortals alike occupied places determined by fate. And this totality was of necessity and economy, a cycle of creation and destruction oscillating between order and chaos, form and indeterminacy, a great cycle of feeding, preserving life through a system of transactions with death. This is the myth of cosmos, of the universe as precarious equilibrium of contrary forces, which undergirded a sacral practice whose aim was to contain nature's promiscuous violence with religion's orderly violence. The terrible dynamism of nature had to be both resisted and controlled by rites at once apotropaic, appeasing chaos and rationalizing with it from the stability of the cult, and economic, recuperating its sacrificial expenditures in the form of divine favor, a numinous power reinforcing the regime that sacrifice served. And this regime was naturally a fixed hierarchy of social power, atop which stood the gods, a little lower kings and nobles, and at the bottom slaves. The order of society, both divine and natural in provenance, was fixed and yet somehow fragile, hierarchy within totality, that had to be preserved against the forces that surrounded it, while yet drawing on those forces for its spiritual sustenance. Gods and mortals were bound together by necessity. We fed the gods, who required our sacrifices, and they preserved us from the forces they personified and granted us some measure of their power. There was surely an ineradicable nihilism in such an economy, a tragic resignation before fate, followed by a prudential act of cultic salvage, for the sake of social and cosmic stability. As it happens, the word tragic is especially apt here. A sacrificial mythos need not always express itself in slaughter, after all. Attic tragedy, for instance, began as a sacrificial rite. It was performed during the festival of Dionysus, which was a fertility festival, of course, but only because it was also an apotropaic celebration of delirium and death. The Dionysia was a sacred negotiation with the wild, antinomian cruelty of the god whose violent orgiastic cult had once, it was so believed, gravely imperiled the city, that the hope that prompted the feast was that this devastating force could be contained within the bright Apollonian forms and propitiated through a ritual carnival and controlled disorder. The polis could survive for another year its precarious peace intact. The religious vision from which Attic tragedy emerged was one of the human community as a kind of besieged citadel, preserving itself through the tribute it paid to the powers that both threatened and enlivened it. I can think of no better example of this than of Antiquity, in which the tragic crisis is the result of the insoluble moral conflict between familial piety, a sacred obligation, and the civil duties of kingship, a holy office. Antigone, as a woman, is bound by the Chthonian gods of the dead, so of family and of household, and Creon, as king, is bound to Apollo, god of the city, and so both are adhering to sacred obligations. The conflict between them, then, far from involving a tension between the profane and the holy, is a conflict within the divine itself, whose only possible resolution is the death, the sacrifice of the protagonists. Other examples, however, are legion. Necessity's cruel intransience rules the gods no less than us. Tragedy's great power is simply to reconcile us to this truth, to what must be, and to the violence of the city that keep at bay the greater violence of the cosmic and social disorder. Nor does one require extraordinarily penetrating insight to see how the shadow of this mythos falls across the philosophical schools of antiquity. To risk a generalization even more reckless than those I've already made, from the time of the pre-Socratics, all the great speculative and moral systems of the pagan world were, in varying degrees, confined to this totality, to either its innermost mechanisms or outermost boundaries. Rarely did they even catch a glimpse of what might lie beyond such a world, and none could conceive of reality except as a kind of strife between order and disorder, within which a sacral economy held all forces in tension. This is true even of Platonism, with its inextricable dualism, its dialectic of change and changeless, or limit and infinite, and its equation of truth with ideic abstraction. The world, for all its beauty, is a realm of fallen vision, separated by a greater chorismos from the realm of immutable reality. It is true of Aristotle too. The dialectic of act and potency, for that of sublunary beings, is inseparable from decay into death, or the scale of essences by which all things, especially various classes of persons, are assigned to their places in the natural and social order. Stoicism offers an obvious example, a vision of the universe as fated, eternally repeated, divine and cosmic history, a world in which finite forms must constantly perish in order to make room for others, and which in its entirety is always consumed in a final ekpyrosis, from which makes a sacrificial pyre, to so to speak, of the whole universe. And Neoplatonism furnishes the most poignant example, inasmuch as its monism merely inverts earlier dualism, Platonism dualism, and only magnifies the melancholy. Not only is the immutable world separated from its divine principle, the one, by intervals of emanation that descend in even greater alienation from their source, but because the highest truth is the secret identity between the human mind and the one, the labor of philosophy is one of escape. All multiplicity, change, particularity, every feature of the living world is not only accidental to this formless identity, but a kind of falsehood. And to recover the truth that dwells within, one must detach oneself from what lies without, including the sundry incidentals of one's individual existence. Truth is oblivion of the flesh, a pure nothingness to attain which one must sacrifice the world. In any event, the purpose behind these indefensibly broad pronouncements, however elliptically pursued, is to aid in recalling how shatteringly subversive Christianity was to so many of the certitudes of the world it entered, and how profoundly its exclusive fidelity to the God of Christ transformed that world. This is, of course, no more than we should expect, if we take the New Testament's paschal triumphalism to heart. Now is the judgment of this world. Now will the prince of this world be cast out. I have overcome the world. He is far above all principality and power and might and dominion, and all things are put under his feet. Having spoiled the principalities and powers, he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it. He led captivity captive, and so on. Still, we can largely absorb Scripture's talk of the defeat of the devil and the angels of the nations and the powers of the air, and yet fail to recognize how radically the Gospels reinterpreted, or as Nietzsche would say, transvalued, everything in light of Easter. The example of this I find most striking is the account in John's Gospel gives of the dialogue between Christ and Pilate. Nietzsche, the quixotic champion of the old standards, thought jesting Pilate's "What is truth?" to be the only moment of actual nobility in the New Testament. The wry taunt of an acerbic ironist, unimpressed by the pathetic fantasies of a deranged peasant. But one need not share Nietzsche's sympathies to take his point. One can certainly see what is at stake when Christ, scourged and mocked, is brought before Pilate a second time. The latter's "Whence art thou?" has about it something of a demand for pedigree, which might at least lend some credibility to the claims Christ makes for himself, for want of which Pilate can do little other than pronounce his truth. I have power to crucify thee, which, to be fair, would be, under most circumstances, an incontrovertible argument. It is worth asking ourselves what this tableau, viewed from the vantage of pagan antiquity, would have meant. A man of noble birth, representing the power of Rome, endowed with authority over life and death, confronted by a barbarous colonial of no name or estate, a slave of the empire, beaten, robed in purple, crowned with thorns, insanely invoking an otherworldly kingdom and some esoteric truth, unaware of either his absurdity or his judge's eminence. Who could have doubted where between these two the truth of things was to be found? But the gospel is written in the light of the resurrection, which reverses the meaning of the scene entirely. If God's truth is in fact to be found... I guess I have company. Hey!
Hey, guys.
Let me...
Keep going.
I got an echo. Someone needs to... Okay, cool. I'm still getting an echo. Sherry, is it? Have you checked?
No, I'm muted.
It's got to be me. I apologize. Let me.
Oh, no worries.
Is it? Are you hearing echo on my end?
When I speak, I'm hearing it.
I don't hear an echo when you speak, but I hear one when I speak and Nate speaks.
How about
Hello,
now?
hello, hello, hello. That's good now.
Okay. All right, we're good.
I had my mute button on, so I can mute. But
I'm still hearing my voice back.
Yeah.
We'll let Jed check his settings. Hey, how about I finish the paragraph I'm on and you take over, Sherry?
Okay.
Let me know when you found the spot. Let's see here. Let me get
I got
back.
the spot. I'm following you here. So.
Okay, let me finish my paragraph. Okay, let's see. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start from the beginning. I'm backtrack to the beginning of this paragraph.
Yeah.
It's worth asking ourselves what this tableau, viewed from the vantage of pagan antiquity, would have meant. A man of noble birth representing the power of Rome, endowed with authority over life and death, confronted by a barbarous colonial of no name or estate, a slave of the empire, beaten, robed in purple, crowned with thorns, insanely invoking an otherworldly kingdom and some esoteric truth, unaware of either his absurdity or his judge's eminence. Who could have doubted where between these two the truth of things was to be found? But the gospel is written in the light of the resurrection, which reverses the meaning of this scene entirely. If God's truth is in fact to be found where Christ stands, the mockery visited on him redounds instead upon the emperor, all of whose regal finery, when set beside the majesty of the servile shape in which God reveals himself, shows itself to be just so many rags and briars.
This slave is the Father's eternal word, whom God has vindicated, and so 10,000 immemorial certainties are unveiled as lies. The first become last. The mighty are put down from their seats, and the lowly exalted. The hungry are filled with good things, while the rich are sent empty away. Nietzsche was quite right to be appalled. Almost as striking for me is the tale of Peter at the cock's crow going apart to weep. Nowhere in the literature of pagan antiquity, I assure you, had the tears of a rustic been regarded as worthy of anything but ridicule. To treat them with reverence as meaningful expressions of real human sorrow would have seemed grotesque from the perspective of all the classical canons of good taste. Those wretchedly subversive tears and the dangerous philistinism of a narrator so incorrigibly vulgar as to treat them with anything but contempt were most definitely signs of a slave revolt in morality, if not quite the one against which Nietzsche inveighed. A revolt, moreover, that all the ancient powers proved impotent to resist. In a narrow sense, then, one might say that the chief offense of the Gospels is their defiance of the insights of tragedy, and not only because Christ does not fit the model of the well-born tragic hero. More important is the incontestable truth that in the Gospels, the destruction of the protagonist emphatically does not restore or affirm the order of city or cosmos. Were the Gospels to end with Christ's sepulture in good tragic style, it would exculpate all parties, including Pilate and the Sanhedrin, whose judgments would be shown to have been fated by the exigencies of the crisis and the burdens of their offices. The story would then reconcile us to the tragic necessity of all judgments. Let's pop Jedediah in here. Whoops, what's going on with my mouse? There we go.
hopefully that.
That's good. Whoops.
Yep, no echo, we're good.
Okay.
All right, you want to pick back up from this, but instead comes Easter?
Where am I now? Oh, yeah. But instead comes Easter, which rudely interrupts all the minatory and sententious moralisms of the tragic chorus, just as they are about to be uttered to full effect, and which cavalierly violates the central tenet of sound economics. Rather than trading the sacrificial victim for some supernatural benefit, and so the particular for the universal, Easter restores the slain hero in his particularity again, as the only truth the Gospels have to offer. This is more than a dramatic peripety. I'm going to struggle with a lot of his words because
It's David.
I don't know where he finds them, but the empty tomb overturns all the responsible and necessary verdicts of Christ's judges, and so grants them neither legitimacy nor pardon. In a larger sense, then, the entire sacrificial logic of a culture was subverted in the Gospels. I cannot attempt here a treatment of the biblical language of sacrifice, but I think I can safely assert that Christ's death does not, in the logic of the New Testament sources, fit the pattern of sacrifice I have just described. The word sacrifice is almost inexhaustible in its polysemy,
Yeah.
particularly in the Old Testament, but the only sacrificial model explicitly invoked in the New Testament is that of the atonement offering of Israel, which certainly belongs to no cosmic cycle of prudent expenditure and indemnity. It is rather a kurban, literally a drawing nigh into the life-giving presence of God's glory. Israel's God requires nothing. He creates, elects, and sanctifies without need. And so the atonement offering can in no way contribute to any sort of economy. It is instead a penitent approach to a God who gives life freely, and who not only does not profit from the holocaust of the particular, but who in fact fulfills the sacrifice simply by giving his gift again. This giving again is itself, in fact, a kind of sacrificial motif in Hebrew scripture, achieving its most powerful early expression in the story of Isaac's Akedah, and arriving at its consummation perhaps in Ezekiel's vision in the Valley of Dry Bones. After all, a people overly burdened by the dolorous superstitions of tragic wisdom could never have come to embrace the doctrine of resurrection. I am tempted to say, then, that the cross of Christ is not simply a sacrifice, but the place where two opposed understandings of sacrifice clashed. Christ's whole life was a reconciling kurban, an approach to the Father, a real indwelling of God's glory in the temple of Christ's body, and an atonement made for a people enslaved to death. In pouring himself out in the form of a servant, and in living his humanity as an offering up of everything to God in love, the shape of the eternal Son's life was already sacrificial in this special sense. And it was this absolute giving, as God and man, that was made complete on Golgotha. While from a pagan perspective, the crucifixion itself could be viewed as a sacrifice in the most proper sense, destruction of the agent of social instability for the sake of peace, which is always a profitable exchange, Christ's life of charity, service, forgiveness, and righteous judgment could not, indeed it would have to seem the very opposite of sacrifice, an economic and indiscriminate inversion of rank and order. Yet at Easter, it is the latter that God accepts and the former he rejects. What then of all the hard-won tragic wisdom of the ages? Naturally, also with the death of the old mythos, metaphysics too was transformed. For one thing, while every ancient system of philosophy had to presume an economy of necessity binding the world of becoming to its inmost or highest principles, Christian theology taught from the first that the world was God's creature in the most radically ontological sense, that it is called from nothingness, not out of any need on God's part, but by grace. The world adds nothing to the being of God, and so nothing need be sacrificed for his glory or sustenance. In a sense, God and world alike were liberated from the fetters of necessity. God could be accorded his true transcendence, and the world its true character as divine gift. The full implications of this probably became visible to Christian philosophers only with the resolution of the 4th century Trinitarian controversies, when the subordinationist schemes of Alexandrian Trinitarianism were abandoned, and with them the last residue within theology of late Platonism's vision of a descending scale of divinity mediating between God and world, the both of them compromised in a single totality. In any event, developed Christian theology rejected nothing good in the metaphysics, ethics, or method of ancient philosophy, but, with a kind of omnivorous glee, assimilated such elements as served its ends, and always improved them in the process. Stoic morality, Plato's language of the good, Aristotle's metaphysics of act and potency, all became richer and more coherent when emancipated from the morbid myth of sacrificial economy and tragic necessity. In truth, Christian theology nowhere more wantonly celebrated its triumph over the old gods than in the use it made of so-called spolia Egyptorum, and by despoiling pagan philosophy of its most splendid achievements and integrating them into a vision of reality more complete than philosophy could attain on its own, theology took to itself irrevocably all the intellectual glories of antiquity. The temples were stripped of their gold and precious ornaments. The sacred vessels were carried away into the precincts of the church and turned to better uses, and nothing was left behind but a few grim, gaunt ruins to lure back the occasional disenchanted Christian and shelter a few atavistic ghosts. This last observation returns me at last to my earlier contention, that Christianity assisted in bringing the nihilism of modernity to pass. The command to have no other God but Him, whom Christ revealed, was never for Christians simply an invitation to forsake an old cult for a new, but was an announcement that the shape of the world had changed, from the depths of hell to the heaven of heavens, and all nations were called to submit to Jesus as Lord. In the great transvaluation that followed, there was no sphere of social, religious, or intellectual life that the church did not claim for itself. Much was abolished, and much of the grandeur and beauty of antiquity was preserved in a radically altered form, and Christian civilization, with its new synthesis and new creativity, was born. But what is the consequence, then, when Christianity as a living historical force recedes? We have no need to speculate as it happens. Modernity speaks for itself. With the withdrawal of Christian culture, all the glories of the ancient world that it baptized and redeemed have perished with it in the general cataclysm. Christianity is the midwife of nihilism, not because it is itself nihilistic, but because it is too powerful in its embrace of the world and all of the world's mystery and beauty. And so to reject Christianity now is of necessity to reject everything except the barren anonymity of spontaneous subjectivity. As Ivan Karamazov's Grand Inquisitor tells Christ, the freedom that the gospel brings is too terrible to be borne indefinitely. Our sin makes us feeble and craven. We long to flee from the liberty of the sons of God, but where now can we go? Everything is Christ's. This is illustrated with striking clarity by the history of modern philosophy, at least in its continental and, so to speak, proper form. It is fashionable at present among some theologians to attempt precise genealogies of modernity, which in general I would rather avoid doing. But it does seem clear to me that the special preoccupations and perversities of modern philosophy were incubated in the age of late scholasticism with the rise of nominalism and voluntarism. Whereas earlier theology spoke of God as goodness as such, whose every act, by virtue of divine simplicity, expresses his nature, the specter that haunts late scholastic thought is a God whose will precedes his nature, and whose acts then are feats of pure spontaneity. It is a logically incoherent way of conceiving of God. As it happens, though I cannot argue that here, but it is a powerful idea, elevating as it does will over all else, and redefining freedom for God and by extension for us, not as the unhindered realization of a nature, the liberty to become what you are, but as the absolute liberty of the will in determining even what its nature is. Thus, when modern philosophy established itself anew as a discipline autonomous from theology, it did so naturally by falling back upon an ever more abyssal subjectivity. Real autonomy could not be gained by turning back to the wonder of being or to the transcendental perfections of the world, for to do so would be to slip again into a sphere long colonized by theology. And so the new point of departure for reason had to be the perceiving subject rather than the world perceived. Descartes, for instance, explicitly forbade himself any recourse to the world's testimony of itself. In his third meditation, he seals all his senses against nature, so that he can undertake his rational reconstruction of reality from a position pure of any certitude, save that of the ego's own existence. The world is recovered thereafter only insofar as it is posited as an act of will. And while God appears in that reconstruction, he does so only as a logical postulate following from the idea of the infinite. From there, it is a short step to Kant's transcendental ego, for whom the world is the representation of its own irreducible I think, and which, inasmuch as it is its own infinity, requires God as a postulate only in the realm of ethics, and merely as a regulative idea in the realm of epistemology. And the passage from transcendental idealism to absolute idealism, however much it involved an attempt to escape egoistic subjectivity, had no world to which to return. Even Hegel's system, for all that it sought to have done with petty subjectivism, could do so only by way of a massive metaphysical myth of the self-positing of the concept, and of a more terrible economy of necessity than any pagan antiquity had imagined. This project was, in every sense, incredible, and its collapse inevitably brought philosophy by way of Nietzsche and Heidegger to its postmodern condition, a heap of broken images. If Heidegger was right, and he was, in saying that there was always a nihilistic core to the Western philosophical tradition, the withdrawal of Christianity leaves nothing but that core behind. For the gospel long ago stripped away both the deceits and the glories that had concealed it. And so philosophy becomes, almost by force of habit, explicit nihilism. Modern philosophy, however, merely reflects the state of modern culture and modern cult, and it is to this sphere that I should turn now, as it is here that spiritual warfare is principally to be waged. I should admit that I, for one, feel considerable sympathy for Nietzsche's plaint. Nearly 2,000 years and no new God. And for Heidegger, intoning his mournful oracle, only a God can save us. But of course, none will come. The Christian God has taken up everything into himself, all the treasures of ancient wisdom, all the splendor of creation, every good thing has been assumed into the story of the incarnate God, and every stirring towards transcendence is soon recognized by the modern mind, weary of God, as leading back towards faith. Antique pieties cannot be restored, for we moderns know that the hungers they excite can be sated only by the gospel of Christ and him crucified. To be a Stoic today, for instance, is simply to be a soul in via to the church. A Platonist, most of us understand, is only a Christian manché, and a polytheist is merely a truant from the one God he hates and loves. The only cult that can truly thrive in the aftermath of Christianity is a sordid service of the self, of the impulses of the will, of the nothingness that is all that the withdrawal of Christianity leaves behind. The only futures open to post-Christian culture are conscious nihilism, with its inevitable devotion to death, or the narcotic banality of the last men, which may be little better than death. Surveying the desert of modernity, we would be, I think, morally derelict not to acknowledge that Nietzsche was right in holding Christianity responsible for the catastrophe around us, even if he misunderstood why. We should confess that the failure of Christian culture to live up to its victory over the old gods has allowed the dark power that once hid behind them to step forward in propria persona. And we should certainly dread whatever rough beast it is that is being bred in our ever coarser, crueler, more inarticulate, more vacuous popular culture. Because cloaked in its anodyne incipience lies a world increasingly devoid of merit, wit, kindness, imagination, or charity. These are, I admit, extreme formulations, but while I may delight in the provocation, I do not wish on this point to be misunderstood. When recently I made these very remarks from a speaker's podium, two theologians, neither of whom I would consider champions of modernity, raised objections. From one quarter, I was chided for forgetting the selflessness of which modern persons are capable. September 11, 2001, I was reminded, demonstrated the truth of this surely, and those of us who teach undergraduates must be aware that for all the cultural privations they suffer, they are often decent and admirable. From the other quarter, I was cautioned that so starkly stated an alternative as Christianity or nihilism amounted to a denial of the goodness of natural wisdom and virtue, and seemed to suggest that gratia non perficit sed destruit naturam. As fair as such remarks may be, however, they are not opposite Okay, that's not opposite, but it sounds like opposite.
Opposite.
Opposite to my argument. In regard to the first objection, I would wish to reply by making clear that I do not intend to suggest, because modernity has lost the organic integrity of Christianity's moral grammar, every person living in modern society must therefore become heartless, violent, or unprincipled. My observations are directed at the dominant language and ethos of a culture, not at the souls of individuals. Many among us retain some loyalty to ancient principles. Most of us are in some degree pre-modern, and there are always and everywhere to be found examples of natural virtue, innate nobility, congenital charity, and so on, for the light of God is ubiquitous, and the image of God is impressed upon our nature. The issue for me is whether, within the moral grammar of modernity, any of these good souls could give an account of his or her virtue. I wish, that is, to make a point not conspicuously different from Alistair MacIntyre in the first chapter of his After Virtue. In the wake of a morality of the good, ethics has become a kind of incoherent bricolage. As far as I can tell, Homo nihilisticus may often be, in several notable respects, a far more amiable rogue than Homo religiosus, exhibiting a far smaller propensity for breaking the crockery, destroying the sacred statuary, or slaying the nearest available infidel. But love, let us be true to one another. Even when all of this is granted, it would be a willful and culpable blindness for us to refuse to recognize how aesthetically arid, culturally worthless, and spiritually depraved our society has become. That this is not hyperbole, a dispassionate appraisal of the artifacts of popular culture, of the imaginative coarseness and cruelty informing them, will quickly confirm. For me, it is enough to consider that in America alone, more than 40 million babies have been aborted since the Supreme Court invented the right that allows for this, and that there are many for whom this is viewed not even as a tragic necessity, but as a triumph of moral truth. When the Carthaginians were prevailed upon to cease sacrificing their babies, at least the place vacated by Baal reminded them that they should seek the divine above themselves. We offer up our babies to my freedom of choice, to me. No society's moral vision has ever surely been more degenerate than that. And to the second objection, I would begin by noting that my remarks here do not concern the entirety of human experience, nature, or culture. They concern one particular location in time and space, late Western modernity. Nor have I anything to say about culture or people who have not suffered the history of faith and disenchantment we have, or who do not share our particular relation to European antiquity or the heritage of ancient Christendom. Nihilism is simply a name for post-Christian sensibility and conviction, and not even an especially opprobrious one. Moreover, the alternative between Christianity and nihilism is never in actual practice a kind of Kierkegaardian either-or posed between two absolute antinomies incapable of alloy or medium. It is an antagonism that occurs along a continuum whose extremes are rarely perfectly expressed in any single life, else the world were all saints and Satanists. Most importantly, though, my observations do not concern nature at all, which is inextinguishable, and which at some level always longs for God. They concern culture, which has the power to purge itself of the natural in some considerable degree. Indeed, much of the discourse of late modernity, speculative, critical, moral, and political, consists precisely in an attempt to deny the authority, or even the reality of any general order of nature or natures. Nature is good, I readily affirm, and is itself the first gift of grace. But that is rather the point at issue, for modernity is unnatural, is indeed anti-nature, and even anti-Christ, and so goeth about as a roaring lion seeking whom it may devour. Which is why I repeat that our age is not one in danger of reverting to paganism. With that, we were so fortunate. If we turn from Christ today, we turn only toward the God of absolute will, and embrace him under either his most monstrous or his most vapid aspect. A somewhat more ennobling retreat to the old gods is not possible for us. We can find no shelter there, nor can we sink away gently into those old illusions and tragic consolations that Christ has exposed as falsehood. To love or be nourished by the gods, we would have to fear them, but the ruin of their glory is so complete that they have been reduced, like everything else, to commodities. Nor will the you'll help me out there, Nate.
Ululations.
And
Lugubrious
okay,
platitudes.
okay, thank you. And pious fatalism of the tragic chorus ever again have the power to recall us to sobriety. The gospel of a God found in broken flesh, humility, and measureless charity has defeated all the old lies, rendered the ancient order visibly insufficient and even slightly absurd, and instilled in us a longing for transcendent love so deep that if once yielded to, it will never grant us rest anywhere but in Christ. And there is a real sadness in this because the consequences of so great a joy rejected are a sorrow, bewilderment, and anxiety for which there is no precedent. If the nonsensical religious fascinations of today are not in any classical or Christian sense genuine pieties, they are nevertheless genuine. If diluted, expressions of grief, encomia for a forsaken and half-forgotten home, the prisoner's lament over a lost freedom. For Christians, then, to recover and understand the meaning of the command to have no other God, it is necessary first to recognize that the victory of the Church in history was not only incomplete, but indeed set free a force that the old sacral order had at least been able to contain. And it is against this more formless and invincible enemy that we take up the standard of the commandment today. Moreover, we need to recognize in the light of this history that this commandment is a hard discipline. It destroys, it breaks in order to bind, like a cautery. It wounds in order to heal. And now, in order to heal the damage it has in part inflicted, it must be applied again. In practical terms, I suspect that this means that Christians must make an ever more concerted effort to recall and recover the wisdom and centrality of the ascetic tradition. It takes formidable faith and devotion to resist the evils of one's age, and it is to the history of Christian asceticism, especially perhaps the
Apothegms.
of the Desert Fathers, that all Christians, whether married or not, should turn for guidance. To have no God but the God of Christ, after all, means today that we must endure the Lenten privations of what is most certainly a dark age, and strive to resist the bland solace, inane charms, brute viciousness, and dazed passivity of post-Christian culture, all of which are so tempting precisely because they enjoin us to believe in and adore ourselves. Someone else want to take over?
Sure. Or actually, how about Jed?
You know where we are?
I'm kind of following on this, so I would have to find where we are.
Okay, I'll do it, Jed. Don't worry.
Okay.
It means also to remain aloof from many of the moral languages of our time, which are even at their most sentimental, tender, and tolerant, usually as decadent and egoistic as the currently most fashionable vices. It means, in short, self-abnegation, contrarianism, a willingness not only to welcome but to condemn, and a refusal of secularization as fierce as the refusal of our Christian ancestors to burn incense to the genius of the emperor. This is not an especially grim prescription, I should add. Christian asceticism is not, after all, a cruel disfigurement of the will, contaminated by the world weariness or malice toward creation that one can justly ascribe to many other varieties of religious detachment. It is rather the cultivation of the pure heart and the pure eye, which allows one to receive the world and to rejoice in it, not as a possession of the will or an occasion for the exercise of power, but as the good gift of God. It is, so to speak, a kind of Marian waiting upon the word of God and its fruitfulness. This is why it has the power to heal us of our modern derangements, because, paradoxical as it may seem to modern temperaments, Christian asceticism is the practice of love, what Maximus the Confessor calls learning to see the logos of each thing within the logos of God. And it eventuates, most properly, the grateful reverence of a Bonaventure or the lyrical ecstasy of Thomas Traherne. Still, it is a discipline for all that, and for us today it must involve the painful acknowledgement that neither we nor our distant progeny will live to see a new Christian culture rise in the Western world, and to accept this with both charity and faith. We must, after all, grant that In the mystery of God's providence, all that has followed from the work of the Holy Spirit in time, modern persons will never find rest for their restless hearts without Christ. For modern culture is nothing but the wasteland from which the gods have departed. And so this restlessness has become its own deity. And deprived of the shelter of the sacred and the consoling mists of sacrifice, the modern person must wander or drift, vainly attempting one or another accommodation with death, never escaping anxiety or ennui, and driven as a result to ceaseless labor of distraction or acquisition or willful idiocy. And where it works its sublimest magic, our culture of empty spectacle can so stupefy the intellect as to blind it to its own disquiet and induce a spiritual torpor more deplorable than despair. But we, while not ignoring how appalling such a condition is, should yet rejoice that modernity offers no religious comforts to those who would seek them. In this time of waiting, it is in this age marked only by the absence of faith in Christ, it is well that the modern soul should lack repose, piety, peace, or nobility, and should find the world outside the church barren of spiritual rapture or mystery, and should discover no beautiful or terrible or merciful gods upon which to cast itself. With Christ came judgment into the world, a light of discrimination from which there is neither retreat nor sanctuary. This means that, as a quite concrete historical condition, the only choice that remains for the children of a post-Christian culture is not whom to serve, but whether to serve him who Christ revealed or to serve nothing, the nothing. No third way lies open for us now, because all of us now know, whether we acknowledge it consciously or not, all things have been made subject to him. All the thrones and dominions of the high places have been put beneath his feet until the very end of the world. And, simply said, there is no other God. So, good morning. Oh, Sherry, you're muted.
Good morning.
So that was
forever.
the essay that broke me. That was the essay that broke me. That was like between Doors of the Sea and that. That was like that's what sent me running back to the church. Those, along with some other factors, but those were huge. Those were huge.
What I said when I was muted was that felt like one of those all-you-can-eat buffets, and you're just like,
right? Because it's like, yeah, it's like the history of it's like the history of the Western world up until this moment, like in the. But and his argument is so like I think the more you know, the more inescapable his argument is.
The more you know, the more you know.
I mean, on the one hand, the more you know, you can try to find ways to evade it. But if the more you know and truly understand, the more inescapable I think his conclusion is.
No, so, Nate, if you don't mind me asking you a question, like what do you feel like? Maybe if you were to back into your situation prior to re-entering into Christianity, and then what was the catalyst within this, and then maybe Doors of the Sea that kind of pushed you back into the fold here?
Well, it forced me to recognize that the principles that I held, which were not merely nihilism, were just inescapably and obviously Christian in shape and form. Mm-hmm. And that I could either live into those or I could live into the nothing, and that there was no alternative. So
interesting.
Okay, can you, in your own words, define the nothing from this essay? Or
well, it seems to me like I have some things to say about nihilism just because I've been kind of doing some readings in Zen Buddhism lately. So I think that there's some different ways to look at nihilisms. But I think like what he's pointing at is kind of the moral nihilism and the kind of the meaninglessness that kind of undergirds like our Western cultures. I don't think that that's the only way to look at nihilism. But I think that's
he's diagnosing a particular kind of nihilism that exists in the culture of the West.
Yeah, not necessarily. Would you say that he that nihilism is actually only existent in the West? Like
no,
that?
no, I don't think he.
No, because we've exported
exist.
we've exported our culture to all the corners of the globe. So
Right, but okay, so it's born in the West.
it's born in the West, but it's spread its wings.
Yeah.
It's
Kind of
it's
like
dark.
the dragon.
It's
the
dark
little baby
satanic
dragons in
wings.
Game of Thrones.
Well, I think like there's a certain element to like Western culture and the way that we have kind of rationalized so much is what we can't deal with is the nothing or the emptiness underneath. It's in a certain respect there's a namelessness and a formlessness that we can't rationally get to, and so in a sense you give up on the whole project of thought, right? And I think there's a sense where Western culture has done that, where we're kind of a post-thinking culture, and where we end up is in a sense of because the nothingness is so vast and terrifying, the illogical leap is then there must be no meaning, right? And I think that's a problem that is kind of particular within like a framework that can only emerge within Christianity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like we just went through the faith essay by George MacDonald, and he talks about this vanishing notion of Christianity, and
The what? The what?
The vanishing. He talks about a false notion of Christianity that needs to vanish. Okay, and in the conversation that we had the other night with McMo, they were talking about their dark night of the soul, Luke and McMo, and I realized that that dark night of the soul, like for one of them it was my God, why hast thou forsaken me, and for the other it was I need to see your face, and both of those are vanishing points, eh? And so in essence they're revelations that the false notion that they held was escaping them, right? It was going away, and so both of them felt the loss, right? Like I can't see your face anymore, or why have you forsaken me? And that's what this kind of this idea of nothingness is reminding me of. It's like the way DBH talks about it, it's everything is subject to him, right? It's all like vortexed up into Christ. And then you would if you don't get vortexed up, like if you're just standing there, everything's gone. Everything you thought you ever knew, right? Is gone, in a sense. Do I have that right?
I don't think you have it wrong. Yeah, it's interesting that this had been the selection 8, because I walked into this pretty blind. I didn't realize that this was what we were going to be talking about.
Well, it was kind of like it was on the. I actually announced it like ahead of time what it was going to be, and I read last week from Doors of the Sea, and then it's like I'm going to read from the other thing that was like critical for me, but I link all the time, and so I see like a lot of. Like, I don't think there's a lot of like Hart is defined the way Hart is defining nihilism in this essay is like it's simply the empty field of whatever the will may choose. Like that is the nothing as such.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of I see a lot of in the comments here like there's a lot of different understandings of,
there's a lot of little philosophers in the comment section.
Yeah, it's an interesting. I'm kind of a little bit behind. I wonder just so kind of where my studies have been taking me lately. I've been kind of wandering and meandering through some Buddhist readings lately, just out of personal interest. I've found it pretty interesting. So you have the Buddhist concept of shunyata, or emptiness, right? Which has been described by some as a form of nihilism, although I don't think that's probably the best term. It's just a formlessness and a dependent arising. Everything comes out of the nothingness or the formlessness. And it made me, in my readings elsewhere, because I've been going back into Tomberg quite a bit, really seeing this dual interplay between the empty and the full.
Yes.
And there's kind of this obverse, not an inverse, but an obverse relationship. Like they're two sides of the same coin. There are two ways of describing a primary reality that can't be fully articulated anyway. And I think we get more comfortable when we're trying to describe kind of that pleroma, or the fullness, because we can name it and we can describe it.
We love naming things.
But then when we drop down below into that field of formlessness or emptiness, it can get intimidating, because there isn't really language in words for. It's not that the void is nothing. There's not empty of everything. It's just that it's a formlessness in the Buddhist line of thinking. But I think in our Western context, that becomes kind of an aggravated sense of, well, if there's nothing there, then there must be no meaning whatsoever, or there must be no purpose whatsoever. And that becomes kind of the nihilism of, modern Western culture. And I see Hart kind of critiquing more of that, kind of the aggravated nihilism that you see, in Heidegger and in Nietzsche. And I think it's an interesting take that he has. It's really interesting also to kind of go back and read some of Hart's older stuff compared to where his writing is now, because I feel like there's some discernible shifts in his perspective as well.
Probably.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, we would hope
For
so,
sure.
right? Like,
For sure.
like, I'm always so annoyed when people are like, well, he changed his mind. Like, well, I hope he did. Like, what do we know? Right? We need to grow. But, okay, so I have a question. It's, these are my, like, dumb questions. But what about, how does this nothingness, like the way you were describing the Buddhist idea of it, it's reminding me of chaos. Like from Genesis, right? Like the earth was without form and void, right?
Mm-hmm.
But out of that, God created. Like he pulled everything out of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually not empty.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I've always considered it like full of potential. It's potential in a sense.
Yeah, it's not empty of content. It's just empty of form. It has not yet been formed into something. This is kind of the way I understand that.
This is, I'm gonna first of all, Oscar sends me amazing emails all the time. He's a longtime listener who is just very incredibly bright guy, very insightful, always asks awesome questions. And I think I think there's something right about this. I think he's become weary. I think what he's become weary of is like he no longer tries to present an orthodox facade, because he's grown weary of trying to get people to see what Christianity is, because they stubbornly insist on continuing to kind of like recast it through the modern lens.
Well, and in some sense, like his book Tradition and Apocalypse is kind of, I feel like, is in some senses like his farewell letter to a certain kind of orthodoxy.
Yeah. I don't know if it's a farewell letter so much as it's a last-ditch attempt to try to get people who want to have a certain kind of orthodoxy.
Right.
It's last attempt to get people who see. Don't tell him that though, Oscar. He gets mad at you.
Hey, 3 cheers for Protestantism.
So when I said in my conversation about Tradition and Apocalypse, I had a conversation with Sam Tiedemann about Tradition and Apocalypse on Sam's channel. And I said, one of the things I said in that conversation was that David had Protestant sensibilities.
I don't think that JBP helps people understand what Christianity is. Laura, could you expand on that in the comments? Just, I'm not a JBP guy like a lot of people here, so I can be the contrary voice.
Okay. What? Okay.
But
So,
anyway,
but yeah, he actually, and
Sorry.
so I was emailing him about another thing, and he's like, oh, he like mentions that he saw this, and he's like, I do not have Protestant I do not, nor have I ever had Protestant sensibilities. Like, so he was offended by the notion they had Protestant sensibilities, but I think he does. And I think here's the thing, and actually you can see it in this essay. You can see it in this essay, and here's where I'll point to. So when he talks about the old Indo-European mythological structure, folks, that's what tradition is. Okay? So the old antique pagan view of the world is tradition. And Christ begins its overthrow with his ministry on earth, and he but it's still like its forces have not been entirely vanquished yet. And have have tried to subvert the church as well, and have tried to return things to that same old hierarchical vision of the cosmos with its identical repetition. Like that is it's always tries to bring itself back. But it fails because Christ is victorious. But it keeps failing over and over again because Christ has in fact been victorious. And so I think tradition and apocalypse is a call to see that the church is still becoming what it is to be. That is like which ties to the point he makes about like freedom being related to the ability to become what one is destined to become, about being able to live in accordance with one's nature, and that applies to I think that applies to the church no less than it does to us as persons. And a lot of times
there's a lot of naming going on in the chat. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just have to say this. Like, there's a lot of naming. Like, I'm just, if you think about what naming is, it's like. I have it. It's mine, and I know what it is, and it's just so interesting. Like I'm just watching. He's a Protestant. He's not. He's Orthodox. He's Jewish. He's, and I'm like, what we're talking about here is all of those things.
Right,
of course, there's going to be a truth for this, that, and the other thing.
But first of all, I want to welcome Laura. I want to welcome Laura to the stream. Welcome, Laura. Thank you for joining us today.
Welcome, Laura.
With that said, because Laura has joined us, I would like to hear what Laura has to say, and I can shut up for a while.
Laura, do you mind expanding on your comments?
I say plenty all the time.
Yeah, I'm interested in what your thoughts are.
Well, yeah, the reason I jumped on was because you were curious about what I meant about Peterson helping people see what Christianity really is. I wouldn't necessarily say like he has the explanation of what Christianity really is, but I think he did help some people perceive it more accurately or like in a fresh way, which is something that David Bentley Hart is also able to do, right? Because reading David Bentley Hart's translation of the New Testament was one of the things that got me to go back to church, because it gave me an opportunity to see it in a fresh light. I think JBP does that as well, because he just explains it at a level and with a perspective that isn't familiar to most people, and it just gives them a chance to take another look at it and go, oh, that's what this is. It was really just that.
Yeah, I totally understood that, Laura, from your comment.
So here's how I'd answer. And Laura, like, by the way, guys, I'm not a big Peterson fan. I know a lot of people here are, so it may help me understand this a little bit more. So let me share with you my perspective on what I see Peterson doing and where my critique is, and then maybe it's room for some discussion here, because I think it's always been a fascinating one with me. And this little corners, they love their Peterson, right? So I see Peterson as more of a kind of an interesting thinker who I think he works within certain Christian forms and does a pretty decent job of that. But I see him basically as kind of kind of this prophet at the twilight of classical liberalism, trying to keep that system moving and going and valid in a world that is increasingly turning away from that. And I see him leveraging anything from Jungian psychology to different biblical readings and all those things in service of kind of this preservation of the older, not necessarily left liberal, but classical liberal strand of thinking. So that's just my perspective, and I'm wondering if like I'm missing something here.
Well, that's really interesting because as you were describing that, I kind of thought, well, maybe, that's probably what he thinks he is. Do you think?
Yeah.
Doesn't he think he's that?
I
But
think-
I'm not
maybe.
sure
I think
if
so,
that's
too.
actually the most significant thing that he did or is doing.
I think you're
Yeah.
entirely right, Laura. I
Yeah,
think so.
yeah.
I think like, and
Well,
that's and unfortunately, like he actually doesn't know where his own genius is.
Mm.
He thinks, or well, maybe he does. I don't know. He thinks that he seems the way he behaves in the world. He does in fact act as if his calling is to defend liberalism and his particular version of like right liberalism. Against like the encroaching forces of illiberalism, which are very serious on both the right and the left, by the way. Like both the right and the left have illiberal elements that are terrifying.
Agree.
Because modern, I mean, and some like, so one of the things like Hart wrote this essay in 2003, and I think like a lot of his observations like were more true in 2003 than they are now, because modernity is in fact starting to crumble around us. So different things are coming into play. Although a lot of what he says is still true. I think what Peterson is actually kind of where his real genius is in kind of pointing out the same thing that Hart is trying to point out in this essay, is that for you, O Western man, there is no valid choice. But it's either Christianity or nothing. Like there are no other gods that are on the table for you. And if you think that there are, you're deluding yourself. And so and Peterson is very good at speaking to that, which is why, and I'm glad you brought up, Laura, I'm glad you brought it up, because the other person who was influential and important for me in coming back to the church, besides David, was Jordan. And that thing right there, the showing the inevitability of Christianity for the Western person, that's where they were both speaking with the same voice. And that's where Peterson doesn't see how good he is.
Well, and see, here's
And he doesn't emphasize that enough.
Yeah, so I think maybe the perspective that I come from is probably more left, so I think that it informs it. So I look at it in some ways, even though they debated, I see them filling similar functions. I tend to lean and more attracted to like Zizek's thought than Peterson's thought, right? Mm-hmm. But interestingly enough, Zizek considers himself a Christian atheist, right? And so I think they're both, I think part of what we see in kind of their broader intellectual debates is there's really, if you're in the West, there's really only one major strand of tradition that you can pick up from, which is now, Jewish and Christian tradition that has basically, it's become kind of the totalizing view of the West, and I guess maybe incorporates some of the older paganisms in its own way. But I think that what Zizek does that is I think he's dealing in some sense with the nihilism in a much more sober and realistic way that
well,
he looks at it squarely.
Zizek is, first of all, I love Zizek, and he's incredibly insightful. And one of the thing is Zizek is able to recognize the sense in which Christianity itself is in fact atheistic, in a way that Christian theology, in a way that Christian theology does not often reckon with. And it's precisely this projection of God as this. What Hart actually talks about this in this essay. It's the idea of theism is really kind of connected to like a particular strand of theology that only happens in the last 500 years, where like God's will becomes the predominant feature of theology, which is a projection of our will that creates a God that is an idol of power, and that God is an idol and needs to be torn down. And in as much as and one of the roles of real Christian theology is to actually, in fact, tear down that God, because it is an idol. The God of Christianity is not a God of theism, because it doesn't, like, the container of theism does not work for that God. The God is way more than the container of theism is capable of managing.
Right, so the new atheists kind of did us a service by smashing an idol, don't you think?
For sure.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think that there's, and I think that kind of goes into some of like my fascination. I mean, I wouldn't call myself an atheist by any means.
But we are blessed.
Christian,
we are blessed with having T-Grog have joined us today.
Hey, folks,
we have amongst us
people.
an atheist, and as far as T-Grog, just from my own perspective, atheists serve a necessary function, because they are their function is to keep us on guard for idolatry.
I am predestined to damnation, so
so you get to be with all the cool people afterwards.
And I am in league with the devil, so there's that, right?
Well, I just saw that Satan has gone into retirement thanks to TikTok. It was a great Babylon Bee.
I think you guys are great. I think this new Gnosticism is fantastic. I mean,
good. 3 cheers for new Gnosticism.
I was a very mean creedal Christian. It's great. I mean,
now you're a mean creedal atheist?
I'm not mean at all, I don't think. I don't believe in eternal damnation. I like clarity. I'm a modern. I like clear things and things to be defined and things so I can understand them. So that's all.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I'm Catholic, so I accept that level of religious experience has to exist. So.
Well, I'm just saying.
I'm not necessarily doing it myself.
Yeah, I listen to these streams. I think if each of you went into a room and wrote down what is Christianity for me, everybody have a different answer.
Right. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. I mean, I just went through
good.
I just went through a faith essay.
Why is that a? Huh?
I just went through an essay. Oh, am I lagging?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Am I lagging? I must be lagging.
I'm not used to this. This is my second stream, so.
I just went through an essay by George MacDonald, and that's exactly what he says. There's an episode on this channel just recently called Ruminations on the faith essay. And we talk about the section in the essay where he says, the God that you believe in is the God of your own understanding. That's what he says. That's what you have faith in, right? So there you go. There you have it. I'm all down with that.
Yeah, I guess.
That's hard, eh? That's not.
I appreciate what little I know about George MacDonald, but problem I have with all this stuff is that it's ill-defined. Everybody's just I've read the Christian creeds, Nicaea, Chalcedon, and I've read the New Testament fairly extensively. And the Apostle Paul says, well, if people want to get circumcised, they should go all the way and get castrated. So there seem to be very definite ideas that need to be believed in order to be saved. Okay.
That's a really good question. What does it mean to be saved?
Saved from what? That's
if we all went in a room and wrote what we think it means to be saved, would we all come up with?
I'll ask you even more basic question than that. Even a more basic question than that. If I were to go around this room right now and I were to ask the question, what does it mean to believe in Jesus? We would get 5 different answers.
Mhm.
So the kind of like, so T-Grog, the kind of like fixing the thing to be whatever it has to be that you want to do is simply not possible. Like that's the delusion that modernity had. That and it is the power of the postmodern critique against it is because that kind of fixed certainty is not available to you. At some point, you're going to have to step into faith, and your faith is most demonstrated by what you act out in the world. So to me, to believe in Christ is to act out that pattern of being in the world through your life.
Okay,
Well,
because
I think that's commendable, but that's not historic Christianity. I mean,
sure it is.
Okay,
that's a commendable sentiment, but
could I frame
Yeah,
it
go
like
ahead.
this? T-Grog?
Yeah.
Could I frame it like this, perhaps? When you look at your wife or your children, does the thing that you see, is it completely like, is it solidified? Is it certain? Does it constantly hold its shape? Does it ever spring outside of the lines for you?
well, I'm not sure what you mean.
Well,
In other
I'm talking
words,
about a person.
in other words, when
you
I
look-
look at my daughter, depending on the lighting, I suppose she would look different. But I don't understand all this.
What about?
Yeah.
I'm actually talking about her personhood. Who she is. Who she is. Maybe that's not something that you see. I don't know.
Well, I can't see her interior mental states, if that's what you mean. All I can do is look at her behavior and facial expressions and
Right.
things like that.
Yeah.
I don't have to,
But is that thing certain to you?
well, what do you mean by is
person.
that thing? In other words,
This is what I'm doing is I'm trying to define what you mean by certainty. Because
well, I don't think certainty. I think we operate in a world of probabilities. Okay, I don't think there is absolute certainty. I think
so then
that
how can
that's kind of an illusion.
Okay.
There are degrees of certainty. I'm holding this coffee cup. Okay, I'm pretty certain about that. Okay, but when you get into, all this stuff that, like David Bentley Hart, who, I mean, I don't know what the hell he's talking about half the time.
Seagar,
But
you're holding this coffee cup is a relationship.
Well,
I'm not kidding. It is. It is a relationship. It's a relationship, and it's a relationship that you trust. And
I'm just laughing because that's like so Grail country.
Well,
it is.
Okay.
Or we could even complicate it further
but
and just say that, like, Nargothrond would say there is no coffee cup.
Whoa.
Well, that's true. You could be a marological nihilist and say the coffee cup doesn't exist. That's a philosophical argument.
Right.
But I won't go to heaven or hell based on what I think about the coffee cup. See? There's the difference. If God is loving and God wants us to understand these things, I would think it's incumbent upon the Lord to make these things very clear. Okay. But they're very unclear.
Fun with you, T-Grog, because I think his job is to obscure things until we.
Oh, isn't that charming?
To seek after. So first of all, like,
just what I'd do as a loving father, I would obscure things so my children don't know if I love them or not. That's what I'd do.
I think there's a pedagogy involved here. Is that we are kind of, in a sense, one way of reading the Christian fall that would come out of Irenaeus, and then Father John Baer would kind of reinforce this, is that there's a pedagogy. It's meant to teach us, kind of like we let our kids make mistakes, and that in that mistake-making process, you eventually narrow things down. I just watched that Tom Cruise movie, Edge of Tomorrow, right? I think it's a brilliant metaphor for the spiritual life, or life in general, right? Is that, what is it? Bill Paxton's character tells him that tomorrow you're going to be born again and you'll be baptized in the fiery crucible of combat, right? And then
I like the movie.
Right, he goes and he dies, but he's making a series of mistakes in the right direction that gets him ultimately to the false omega point and then to the true omega point, right?
So Jedediah, wouldn't a Hindu say that? Well, that movie's about reincarnation, see?
Right.
So we can overcome karmic debt. See,
Sure.
These are ways of interpreting experience,
right?
Like nihilism. Nihilism is a way of I'm sad. I'm not going to live forever. It's so depressing. The universe is big. The universe doesn't care about me. That's a way of interpreting your experience. Now, I went through that when I left Christianity. I went through nihilism. Oh my God. But, you just have to live your life and be nice to people. And I don't see that you need Christianity for any of that.
I don't think you do.
Don't see it.
No, I don't either.
Hey, Mitch, hop in anytime.
Yeah, I mean, I just all this metaphysical baggage that's layered on top, and all this wordiness, like with David Bentley Hart. I used to read that stuff all the time, Aquinas, and oh my goodness. But it's like, okay. It's speculation. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Could I ask you one more question before Mitch jumps in? Because I don't want to hog the mic here. But just so, what was your point of departure then? Like, what do you feel like your point of departure? So you had a Christian background of some kind.
I was a fundamentalist, Baptist, Calvinist. Okay.
Poor guy.
And
Poor guy.
I was a 6-day creationist.
Okay.
And I was all in.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of certainty there. Woo!
Yeah, but I think if you read the New Testament, there are certain things, you have to believe this and you have to believe that. Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and thou shalt be saved. Mm-hmm. That's, who's Jesus? Is he a person, like a human being, or is he the God-man? Is he the second person of the Trinity? These are questions that people have tried to answer, and you could disagree with them, but they tried to clarify what they meant by that, and I find that I like clarity. I like clarity. I like when I have a contract to do a real estate transaction or something. I'm a retired broker. I want clarity in the contract. I don't want obscure metaphysical, musings by David Bentley Hart, who's obviously a smart guy, poor writer, but a smart guy. Mm-hmm. It's all verbiage to me. It's like, okay, get your point, make your point, like David Hume. I love David Hume because he makes his points. He's smart, but he makes his points.
I think
clarity.
that particular piece was more. I think that simply as an academic point, that particular piece was more historical than it was metaphysical. He's just laying out the history. There's nothing. There is zero metaphysical argument in that piece at all.
I don't know about that. I'd have to reread it. But he's interpreting history in a very specific manner. Okay.
He's interpreting history as it unfolded, because the thinkers in philosophy that he describes were all basically coming from a Christian culture, and it was through their thought processes that they basically evaporated. They denatured the world. Okay, is what they did. They denatured it, and then you're left with Nietzsche going, "Where's God? We've killed him." Okay, that's what happened.
When you say denatured the world, you mean the Christians did that by making everything supernatural, or?
No, it was Tigron. It was already supernatural. What are you talking about? The world was full of gods.
full
Well,
of
I'm
God.
just saying. I'm trying to figure out what. Okay,
Materialist,
he's
materialist, physicalist.
interpreting history in a specific manner, which is, I mean, if you've read a lot of history, you know that people disagree
What's the
on
manner that you think he's interpreting it
everything in
in?
history, everything, literally. Okay.
I-
So he has a specific interpretation. The first thing I'm doing, like I'm reading Dominion right now, I'm going to fact check what these things are that he's saying. This takes a lot of time.
You can't
Fact
really.
check what they're saying, and then you say, well, what's the other side? Like, oh, modern people, they're very depressed and lonely and sad. Well, what were like in the Middle Ages? Would that be and joyous all the time? Oh, my child just died of cholera. I'm so happy now. I just, it's kind of a false dichotomy here that
Okay.
it's seemingly ahistorical.
Hey, let's Sherry. Let's try to give Mitch a chance to.
I was
Yeah.
I was just
speak.
going to actually say that. Luke and Mitch are here, so I thought maybe they could say something.
Sure.
Oh, that's okay. I'm happy to listen. I jumped in because I saw some faces I liked and just wanted to be in the mix.
Not mine though.
Yours too, T. Greg. I saw you
Greg,
for
you're
the
good.
first time speak recently and enjoyed listening to you. So, well, it's funny. I think a lot of the things that I was hearing just kind of as I was going about housework and everything was, I thought, man, it feels like a lot of the things that are taken for granted as deconstructed are things that are still intact for me. So I always find it interesting. I was like, whoa, what am I still doing thinking all these things? And but here I am still thinking all these things that it seems like I think you do need the to believe in Christ to be saved, and I think I have an understanding of what you're being saved from, and it's not lost on me that all of that can be easily deconstructed, but I think everything can be deconstructed, yet you're still left with having to teach, train, rebuke, correct, behave. And so I don't know.
Well, I appreciate your clarity. But what are you saved from?
Yeah, so here we go. Let's just walk through it, I guess.
Death.
And see how it falls apart. But damnation, death, condemnation, suffering.
What do you mean by damnation? Eternal conscious torment in the fires of hell?
Yeah, that's a not a bad way of putting it. That's a way that it seems to have been put.
Yeah, okay. I used to believe that. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think to some level, like, so, coming from a Christian universalist perspective, and I actually, you and I, T. Grog, have very similar backgrounds. It was a very conservative Presbyterian, was never necessarily six-day creation. So you're checking off boxes that I'm like, oh yeah, I've been there. So it's interesting that you and I have gone in kind of different directions here. But, I don't look at the threat of an eternal conscious torment as anything other than a bogeyman that we made up by a certain kind of reading of the text that is probably more of a feature in our own conscious and subconscious experience than it is a reality that's being revealed. Just because I don't think anything in the text demands that we interpret it that way. And so anyway, that's one aside. That's a bogeyman that I don't spend much time very afraid of one way or the other. Doesn't mean I negate the possibility of some kind of divine judgment or evaluation of the life we've lived. But I think that, like, one of the things that Christianity speaks to at this deeper level is, I think that there's a common, maybe not totally universal, but a very common sense of the wish to go on, that there's something in us that goes on beyond death, and death presents itself as a fundamental problem to that fundamental longing of continuance, right? So I think that there's that element that, whether you agree with it or not, I think Christianity is answering. But I think that the problem of death and the problem of sin, especially in the writings of Paul, are uniquely intertwined. That the fear of death is the power of sin, and keeps us kind of locked in this prison that we are being liberated from. And so when, you may get a different answer from a different Christian, which I would understand that. But in a sense, I see salvation as a kind of a liberation, an act of rescue, not so much from, some mean, angry, vindictive God, but in a sense, a rescue from what we have made ourselves into. And so if that makes sense, I don't know if what your answer would be to that, but that's just one way that I would approach the question. There's probably a few other directions I'd go as well, but that would be one thread of argumentation. I would say, yeah, this is the legitimate anxiety over death is something that Christianity addresses, but in ultimately within a Christian universalist scheme, that's a cosmic restoration that's being effected.
Well, thank you for your perspective.
Yeah.
I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
It's also St. Paul's perspective, by the way, T. Grog. It's not just
although
his.
I am the odd man out here. So
you're surrounded.
I would just say this. The problem is,
could I just interject?
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sorry,
please.
I just wanted to address the what does it mean to be saved question. I don't talk about myself as being saved, actually. I don't think that saved has a point on a timeline. I think that I am becoming. I think that I am being saved, right? And for me, that is a movement into who I really am, which comes through union with the divine.
Maybe you just think about.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, there's
salvation.
Many traditions in Christianity. You are being saved. In other words, Orthodox, Roman Catholic Church. You're unlike, once saved, always saved, and yeah. So
well, I think that too, but not in the same way. But yeah.
I think everybody's going to have a view of. There's no getting around in the Christian imagination salvation, right? It's just everybody's maybe going to have a different idea of what that means. But salvation's, it's so cooked into the text from top to bottom. It's like the end of it's like the goal of your faith is salvation. And so it seems like people vary on what that means, but salvation is always going to be a through line, kind of the beating heart of it in some ways.
So, Mitch, do you think that there was a real garden in Mesopotamia, and two people were in the garden, and they ate of the wrong tree, and therefore they were cursed, and the earth was cursed? Is that how you approach this?
That would be a good way of looking at it. I would never argue with someone on that if they said that.
Hey,
I'm just saying, you're saved from sin. Where does this sin come from? What is the origin? What does it mean? That's the thing that Christians don't agree on. So.
Well, you nailed it. It's cast in that garden story, and a lot of people are going to be more lyrical about it than I can be.
Right.
I think a plain kind of a poor sense reading of it is not a bad one.
Well, does it bother anybody in this stream that the science has shown us that the universe is many billions years old?
Not at all.
And that humans have been around for probably 100, 200,000 years. And death has been ubiquitous in the history of life on Earth.
Right.
But, when Paul says the wages of sin is death, so death is just been in the history of the universe for as long as there have been living organisms. So this whole metaphysical structure seems to be undermined by geology, biology.
But I mean, so here I'll step in here
mind.
just from a scientific perspective. So I mean, if you follow some of the discussions over at Kirk J. Mungel's channel of Theories of Everything, you're going to see that like science itself is moving away from the materialistic paradigm.
Yeah.
And is all these questions are being reopened essentially. Like you think of the work of a guy like Donald Hoffman, who is basically saying like, look, what we see in front of us is not reality. It's basically like very similar to like our user interfaces on a computer. We're seeing certain layers of it. It's being presented to us in a certain way, but there is a deeper operating system at work that doesn't work off of the same rules of observation, right? And so I think like even the materialistic paradigm, I think ultimately it's going to reduce to the same set of circularities that you're going to have in a metaphysical paradigm. Like the circularity is like pretty much unavoidable. I think it's just which one can you live with? And I also just want to take a quick second to pause and say, Luke, your mustache is looking more glorious than ever. I'm really jealous.
So,
I shaved mine off. It was diminished. The bigger my mustache got, the less I was getting kissed. So I lost the fight. And
it's a good fight.
Maybe I need to fight the good fight again.
No, that's the right decision. For the first time in my life, my wife has actually been okay with this. So
I've got work to do.
I didn't like it because of getting my food all the time.
It gives you a snack.
That's why I get rid of it.
That's a struggle. What were you going to say, Nate?
I was just going to encourage. I was anxious to hear what you had to say since you joined us.
Me too.
I'm just kind of listening. I talk all the time, so I'm happy.
Well, that's kind of how I feel. I mean, I love these conversations, and I love that. I guess the one contribution I'll add, because for anybody that's very interested in my takes on things, they can find them. There's lots of my opinions on things, and I'll just spout a bunch of confusing Lucasms anyhow. But the thing that I really like about, I want to jump in because I like that T-Grog is here, because I don't like what Nate said at the very beginning about, this is a very Peter Rollins thing, by the way, too. And I love Peter Rollins as this theologian I love, is that atheists help, they're there and they help you see your own idolatry. And that's a big thing. I had a live stream, Canonize the Heretics, because I think without the heretics, without the fringe, without the disagreement, it's very easy to fall into intellectual idolatry and groupthink. And the one comment that people have been making a lot is that, T-Grog, you're being very gracious, and you are being surrounded by a bunch of believers. But one of my Lukeisms is there's always a unity. There's a implicit unity behind any distinction, which is what allows you to make the distinction to begin with. And so I think most of the people in Grail country and who are in this corner of the little corner of the internet are people that intuitively lean into that all the time, the unity behind any distinction. And so like believer, non-believer, Christian, non-Christian, there's a unity behind that. And that's probably my word that I would say. So it doesn't bother me. It doesn't.
So that's
bother me at all.
that is actual metaphysics. A literal interpretation of Genesis is just stupidity, not metaphysics.
So
And before the 19th century, nobody thought about doing it. By the way,
So Paul didn't think Adam was a real person?
Oh.
He didn't think that?
didn't think he was a real
Potentially
person.
Did Paul
Maybe
think
it wasn't an
Adam was
important
a
question.
real person?
I think Adam was a real person.
See,
Of course.
he thinks he's a real person. There you go.
Real person
real-
real person is a different way of framing the question than saying that the story of Genesis is a literal historical event and not a myth, which is what it actually obviously is. Its structure is obviously mythological. It's obviously a myth. It was always viewed as a myth. That doesn't mean that it's not also true, because myth is besides is more than this idea we have, like postmodern post enlightenment, of just like something that's not true. Myth is also something which is the deepest structures of truth, because they point to things that are like so deep within us that that we can't evade them. There's a way in which the fall is an inevitable truth of our lived experience. Like we've all experienced the fall. 100% guarantee it. If you examine
How so?
how so,
So yeah, how so?
Loss of innocence.
what was
Becoming
that?
an individual, the fall from the mother, cutting the umbilical cord, leaving your family. It's all a fall.
Becoming self-aware.
Yep.
Yeah.
These are all hypotheses.
They're not hypotheses.
This is
They're the universal lived experience of everyone who's ever been.
But that's to say the fall is that, and everybody's in the fall. It's like defining.
There was
I
a
don't
time.
understand
There
this.
was a
I
time
get
in
it.
your life before you would ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil,
Yep.
I see.
and
I
you
don't
live
agree.
with it, and
There was
You
a
don't
time
have-
before you reckoned thought in categories of good and evil.
Yeah,
So
I don't.
even-
I
You
just
notice
don't
it
agree.
not only
I
in your
think that-
memory, but you notice
yeah,
it as you raise children.
I think we're way into the woods here.
Well, let's
in
go back to
my view.
Heidegger and like a more materialistic reading of the fall, right? So one of the great Heideggerian authors of modernity was John Steinbeck, really influenced by Heidegger's idea of Dasein, being there, right? He was a materialist, and he's the one who writes East of Eden. And so if you take this story that's happening in Eden as kind of remove the question, was it historical or not historical, out of the question, which I know coming from a guy who came out of 6-day creationism, like that, that can be a hard thing to do, but reading it as an archetype of human experience of this loss of innocence and this grappling with, the main point in Steinbeck's East of Eden was Tim shall thou mayest, right? And that ultimately I
haven't read it in a long time. So
it's such a good, go back and reread it. It's so good.
One of my favorites.
But
yeah,
so it's like there's ways in which these stories and these like kind of perennial truths ring true even outside of the circles of, let's say, an orthodox understanding of them.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's illustrative of the bigger point that there are certain features in the human religious and spiritual experience that are touching on something that is more or less universal. Doesn't necessarily mean we all universally agree on the nature of those experiences, but there is a sense where I think I don't think it's unwarranted to say that there's a way in which we all experience the fall. It just may not be, it may be, like in a sense, some sort of rite of passage where we're kicked out of the comfort of one area in our life. Like we graduate from high school and then all of a sudden we find ourselves in the wide world beyond. Like there's these certain threshold experiences that in some sense echo the fall, and not in a way that's, determining, our position vis-a-vis, salvation and damnation, but just what is our experience and how are we experiencing these realities. And so for me, I see these stories operating on multiple levels. And I'm kind of more in favor of like a pre-temporal or a fall that exists outside of time, but that's because I'm, I read Origin and
Because
Maximus
you exist outside of
these
time.
guys a little more carefully. So anyway, yeah.
I just want to say I can sympathize with you a bit, T-Grog, because when I was growing up, the line I always got about the creation story in Genesis was it's a metaphor for what really scientifically happened, whatever. And so I accepted that for a while, but then when I thought about it more, it seemed unsatisfying because it seemed to me that a metaphor for how creation really happened should tell you the actual story of what really happened, but just in more of a story way that you can understand.
that would be good.
I got to the point of thinking, this isn't even a metaphor for what really happened, right? And then that kind of messed me up for a while because I thought, well, what was creation apparently actually like? What was the process of the world forming actually like? And what was early, human
Modern
evolution really
science
like?
tells
This
us what
does
it
not
was.
seem to be a metaphorical account of that, right? Of the story that I got from my high school biology teacher, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then I was unsatisfied with that for a while, and it bothered me. But this other interpretation where it's really more of a story that is outside time rather than a story that actually tells us in some way what the procedure of creating the world was and what happened to humanity right after the world was created on a timeline, right? But if you see it as this kind of outside time story about something that happens to everyone, it makes more sense.
You're freezing up. Couldn't hear you.
Yeah.
I can hear her.
I can hear. Yeah.
I couldn't hear her. It's
Well,
probably
you can hear me?
But see,
Yeah.
so here's what I would posit, Laura. Like the entirety of all of the materialistic notion of creation, it can be summarized in the one line: "And God moved across, and the spirit of God moved across the face of the waters." That's all of material creation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but
waters-
I mean, I'm just saying, if I rewind my life 20 years, right? I had this notion, and I had this notion that came from the Christian theology I was taught, which is that God created the world to be a certain way in time, and then at a point in time, this act of disobedience occurred that like caused death to come into the world.
yes,
etc., right?
the
But there
traditional
wasn't death
Christian
in the world
understanding.
before that because God made the world to be good and not have any death in it, right?
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
But that actually, that just doesn't jive with what we suppose we
wrong.
know about the actual.
Well, but it's
Okay, so-
but see, that's what I mean. It's like
Yeah.
you're reading theology only from a certain point in history. If you go back and read like older theologians in the church, for Maximus the Confessor, creation happens at the cross.
Well,
Amen.
there you go.
No, I get it. I'm just saying that, like,
I
I
don't
get
agree.
where T-Grog is coming from because people have helped me to see how the story in Genesis can be be interpreted differently or viewed differently from what I grew up with. But like, I'm just saying what I grew up with and why it was a problem for me because I think T-Grog had a similar experience.
I just would like to say about this idea of like when you pointed that out, Laura, like there was no death before and now suddenly there's death, right? That seems preposterous to think that, that could actually be a reality. But when I look at my animals out in the field, they have no concept of death, of an end, because they live completely in the moment, right?
Right.
So if they suddenly became self-aware, then suddenly there would be death in the world for them.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, like this is how I perceive these so-called metaphors. And the other thing that I wanted to say was, or ask was, what is the actual, like Laura, you probably know this, like the etymology of metaphor. I know it has a Greek. It's something about a bridge, right? What is that?
Ooh, I'm not sure.
Metaphor.
Etymology Googling time.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing right now.
Okay.
because there, in literature, there has been this great mourning
Okay.
of the metaphor.
Are you ready?
Okay. Yes.
Mhm.
Meta, to carry, to bear.
Yeah.
Plus, from bear to carry, also to bear children.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Really? I've got meta meaning in the
Meta-
midst of or in common with or by means of.
yeah, from meta over across plus Farron
okay.
to carry. Yeah, from meta
for
over
is to
across
bury. Okay.
plus Farron to bury. To
Right, so it's
carrier to bear. Which
you know
from,
what it is? It's
what's-
it's the story of Saint Christopher. It's what it is.
You're
That's
carrying
what a
things
metaphor
over.
is, right? It carries meaning across, right? And that's why
Right.
we use them, because we can't assume when we're speaking to someone what they mean. We can only hear what they say. But the meaning is lost.
Yes.
The meaning is completely lost to us, okay? So the metaphor helps us carry the meaning across to the person, right?
and the symbol binds together.
Mediate.
Yeah. And so, but what's really interesting about metaphor, because I've been thinking about metaphor for like 4 years, and I'm not done with it, is that it's dead. Like we have lost, like living metaphors are almost non-existent because we have lost a way of living in the world. We have denatured it essentially. And so when we speak in metaphors, we're not actually carrying the meaning across anymore, because people are just like, that's not true, right? Because everything has to be true. And the thing is, when we speak, and I'll just say this again, when we speak to each other, we mean something.
Hey, Nate, can you pull
And
that
that
comment from
meaning
Tertium up here? 939.
has to be carried across, right?
This one?
And so, yeah, well, I'll let Jed answer that question.
Metaphors are not abstract concepts. They're the substructure of language itself.
Yep.
Like
Yeah.
so even if you
That's
were
why
to
they're dead. They're dead because you think they're
the term understanding itself is a very good example of that, by the way.
Right.
Understanding.
Right. So even if you want to take it.
Oh, there we go. There, McMo had me all right. I didn't even see it in the comments. He was already ahead of me.
Yeah. So
yes.
So and this is an important point, and even one that can touch into kind of the evolution of language itself. Is, at some point we evolved the ability to generate terminology, tree, rock, lion, whatever it is, and then the explosion of language has to do with understanding the relationships between things. So to say this man is a lion, you have to have some grasp of what a man is and what a lion is, and what the comparison is, right? And in a sense, language is just that. It's a comparison between unlike to derive a sense of what is like, right? And so a common field of understanding. So I don't think that there's, I think what has happened in the modern world and what's kind of evacuated our metaphors of meaning is we've gone into these cold analogies. I think it's the abstraction and the move away from the concrete.
Yes.
Right. So if you read the ancient languages, whether it's Latin,
and Jed, that it has happened because of the fact that we have divorced truth from the good and the beautiful. That is specifically what caused it, because we have elevated the value of truth on its own, and we have invented this notion of objectivity, and we seek things that are like objects in the world, and that's all we care about.
Right.
Yeah,
because it gives us power.
So even to say to say that this man is a lion, right, is you have two unlike objects, and then a new reality emerges in the comparison. Right.
Isn't Oscar awesome, by the way? It's like Cormac McCarthy quotes.
And so a new form of understanding is possible in that comparative reality of language. And all language is metaphor. At some level, we don't communicate outside of that. It's just that it's evolved to a point where the metaphors really? They recede. We're not aware of the fact that we're making these comparisons in everything we speak, because my language will be more and more abstracted from the real thing. So one of my favorite examples is when we see in the Hebrew Bible, it's translated as before, right? Well, it's the lepani, it's to the face, right? Mm-hmm. There's a sense where you to be before the God was to be to God's face or toward God's face, right? And it was literally, that was the term. And now we say before or in the presence of, and these are kind of abstractions from a more concrete reality, right, that is reflected in Greek, Latin, Hebrew. These languages emerged out of the concrete experience of the real world, and then the connections create the abstraction.
It's so interesting, Ted. I'm just thinking about George Carlin. He has a whole bit on this. Okay, he talks about the word shell shock. Okay. So he says at one point, after the First World War, men would come home and they were acting weird. And so they called it shell shock. You can imagine George doing that, eh? Mm-hmm. Shell shock. And he's like, it sounded like a bomb, and it did. And then it went, and then, after the Second World War, it went to battle fatigue. Right. And now we've got it down to post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And so he even demonstrates that the syllables get longer in the words. Okay, so first it's shell shock, right? And then it's battle fatigue. right? And then it goes post, and it's so interesting. Like it's a fabulous bit. If anybody gets a chance to see it, I think it's called Euphemisms or something. And he just shows how in doing this, we remove it away from ourselves, okay? So it doesn't touch. It's too painful. It's literally too painful. And so abstraction is a way of protecting yourself from things. It's so interesting. Anyway, I just thought of that when you were talking.
Well, and theology does, this is where theology gets, I think it's a very perilous exercise, is because it relies so much on the abstract language, is that it removes God from the domain of experience and just into the realm.
We always circle back to Barfield, don't we?
Yeah, it's that we can no longer experience it, so we can fight about it and describe these abstract ideas that we call God and say, does this abstract idea exist or not? And I think where I'm far more interested in terms of Christian practice, and I bring in different forms, so I'll read the Buddhists or the Hindus, and they're all very fascinating. But to me, what's really valuable in the domain of Christian belief is that it entails a real encounter with God. It's not about a set of abstract ideas that I think can be falsified one way or the other, but like a genuine, real, and living experience. And in the absence of that, all I'm doing is, in a sense, arguing about a set of abstractions that I may or may not have may have some tangential experience with, but has never really penetrated into a sense of real knowing, where that becomes internalized in a sense.
Yeah. And, like when I was asking T-Grog before about, does the shape of your daughter or the shape of your wife ever spring outside of the lines, right? Essentially, I was thinking about the qualitative aspect of who they are. Like, it seems to me, T-Grog, that for you, certainty is a sort of a quantification of something, right? Like it's definitive. You can write it down, you can add it up, you can subtract things from it, you can, and so it has this quantitative quality. Interestingly enough,
I think T-Grog said that he was fully willing to admit that he doesn't believe there's such a thing as certainty. So I think maybe
but then
it's just a matter of
referring back. I don't want to speak to T-Grog.
Well,
about him in the third
just
person.
to clarify, I think that it's degrees. I mean, could be living in the mind of Cthulhu, right? The dreamless god who's sleeping in Azeroth. It's possible. Okay, it's not self-contradictory, but
bonus points for Lovecraft references.
Is it a live option for me? I don't think so. When you talk about emotions, yes, of course you have emotions towards the people you love. By the way, if I had a stroke, my emotions could change. Okay, so
does the love change though?
These are things that we can study scientifically. We understand them, and that paradigm, in spite of the fact that humans are not adapted to scientific thinking because we're apes, it's depressing, and people can't handle it. What they want is a story. They want a story.
Let me back up, though. I think we are adapted to scientific thinking fairly early on. How did we develop like flint knives?
Well, I'm talking about modern science. Modern science has been around, since Newton or Galileo or something like that.
But that experimentation.
Yeah, sure. People did things. They made arrowheads,
right?
Things like that. Yeah, I understand that. But I'm talking about describing the world in terms of mathematical theories that that lead us to testable predictions about what the hell is going to happen.
But I want to parse. I really can't resist the urge to try to parse that statement, though, that humans are not adapted to scientific thinking. What does that even mean?
Yeah.
I'm not. Serious question.
It means that it took Aristotle. It took till Aristotle formalized logic. It took till Newton or Galileo to start creating mathematical theories to explain reality. That took a long time. If humans have been here for 100,000 years or more, that's a long time.
Yeah, but that way of expressing it that are not adapted to. So what that means? So what I take
People are
that to
bad
mean.
at thinking. They're bad at it. Very
Okay.
bad. Very bad.
But it
That
means,
is something.
to me, it means that science has to be invented and not discovered.
Yeah, people invented it. That's
Which
correct.
would mean that mathematics is invented and not discovered.
Yes, it's invented. It's a language to describe reality. That's
So,
what it
Tigard,
is.
do you mind if I back up and ask you a
It's
question?
floating around Platonic heaven.
You-
That's
Well,
how I
you-
feel
then,
about
then we have no reason to trust it.
Yeah.
If it's
No, it works.
if it's
It
simply
works.
invented, okay. So we want to.
It works.
So that means it works that means that it works becomes our truth paradigm.
Well, but it
I
does
think
work.
that's
But
a reasonable truth paradigm. What's the alternative?
Okay. So
Well,
then
here-
that
here's
means
the-
that we should murder all people that we deem defective because they don't work.
No, I'm saying making testable predictions. That's you're jumping into some depraved notion here.
No, I'm not. I'm saying that
but my point is, you make predictions, and the predictions are verified or they're falsified. For example, 1 Kings 18. Let's take 1 Kings 18. Elijah says, "Hey, I'm going to show that your God is not the true God. I'm going to prove it. I'm going to prove it to you." And then, if you don't know the story, read it. It's evidentialism all the way. Yahweh burns up everything, and they don't go, "Oh, it's a metaphor." They go, "Wow, Yahweh did it. He actually did it." Jesus worked miracles. He heals blind people. That's a sign that he is Messiah. It's a sign. That's scientific.
He also said an evil generation
That's
seeks a sign.
scientific.
No, that's not
Huh?
scientific. It's mechanistic.
well,
There's a
No.
difference. In my opinion, there's a
God,
difference between
you
that.
have a testable prediction. Baal doesn't come through. Yahweh does. It's
Right,
very
it's cause and
simple.
effect. It's cause and effect. It's mechanistic thinking, and that's why we're in the mess we're in.
well, if you look
Well,
at
I
like,
guess Yahweh's mechanistic then.
let's just go within like an evolutionary framework here. I want to play with this
I don't know if
because
Yahweh
it's an
is.
interesting one. So let's say like that scientific thinking is somehow arises out of the evolutionary process somehow, right?
Mhm. Like the Black Death.
Sure, both. Like I'm fine granting that both do. By the way, the question would be in what like it becomes advantageous to us until it doesn't. And so like a key example would be going back and watching the Oppenheimer movie, right? At some point, science may actually work out to be disadvantageous
That's
for our
correct.
evolutionary continuance, right? So the
correct.
evidence, the fact-based evidence, being able to discern outcomes and those kinds of things may not actually be ultimately
Well, it may be beneficial because people are too stupid and not developed cognitively enough to handle it. I
well, that
agree
would have
with
been
that.
an evolutionary mistake then, right? That would have been
Well,
an
there's a lot of
evolutionary dead end if
evolutionary
it leads to us into a parking lot.
Yeah,
Well-
but then it gets back to the question, T. Grog, like that Nate posed. Well, how do you trust it then? How do you trust your own logic? How do you trust the place
Because
that
it
you
works.
went
It works.
Right.
how-
Okay. So
If you
that's
don't think logically, you have a
Right.
problem. You run into problems. If you don't think scientifically, and if you have a brain tumor, you go to a witch doctor as opposed to a neurosurgeon, you're going to have a problem.
Right.
That's
and,
all.
and so this
Well-
is what I'm
well-
trying to problematize here is that I don't think that the empirical process is the panacea that the materialists want to say that it is, because it's the empirical process itself that is kind of, in a sense, opened Pandora's box. Right.
Well, read the history of the Middle Ages. I mean, they didn't have science the way we know,
but they couldn't destroy.
and
They couldn't destroy the
was
planet with their
hor-
technologies.
Yeah,
Well,
I
this is
understand
how-
that,
this is also
but
how
life was horrible.
this is precisely
short,
the-
brutal.
the paradigm of it works is precisely how truth becomes divorced from goodness and beauty, and we
I
become
don't
like
think the Middle Ages were parts goodness and beauty. Believe me, I don't think so.
I think
They're
that
not.
I think that they face similar contradictions and barbarities that we do, but to say that that was absent in the Middle Ages, I think it was.
They were barbarous to an unbelievable degree.
And
well,
how
not
many
in
people-
comparison
how many
into
people
not
were
in
slaughtered
comparison
in
into the
20th
pagan
century?
classical age that came before them,
That all depends on
which
I
you will
don't agree with that.
which you will discover as you're reading Dominion.
Like
I
Verdun,
think
Auschwitz,
Holland,
Hiroshima. Like these were
Holland
20th century.
Holland is a guru.
We
He
were
says
just
we're
No,
really
Holland's
getting
not. No, Holland's not a guru. Like, no, seriously,
It's a guru.
compare anything in the Middle Ages to Ashurbanipal.
I'm just not sure how.
Give me a break.
If you think that
Well,
thinking,
I would say this: Assurbanipal didn't have a society dominated by Christianity.
Okay.
So
He was
the
definitely
Middle
like
Ages
if you're
are
saying that,
barbarous and wretched.
if you're saying that the church has failed to become what it's called to become, I would say the answer to that is yes.
yeah,
But we're not. But we are still becoming what we are to become. We're not.
Well, yeah, it's a promise in the future, like Jesus is coming back. Same
Well, that
promise.
is where we are. We are in the realm of becoming. Nothing is yet as it shall be.
I would just say that Christianity dominated the West, and the East, by the way, if you look at Byzantium, for 1,000 years. And these are ages of barbarism, slavery, death, no science, ignorance, illiteracy. I mean, it's ridiculous. And then it's like, well, we need Christianity to have civilization. Well,
And to all of that,
see it.
I would say absolutely you're correct, but I don't think that the idea that science has just accelerated a process that's more fundamentally human than it is Christian or non-Christian, right? Because you go back and you look at the 20th century, it is a legacy of, you got Verdun, Auschwitz, Hiroshima, Vietnam. Like, I mean, we're talking about
I understand that because
killing
humans are apes.
right?
They're modified
okay,
apes.
so
That's
now
all.
I'm going to jump in again, and I'm going to say, if that's what you think, how do you trust your logic?
Because it works. When I think logically, when I think logically,
That's like the monkey with his
I can
hand in the
understand
trap.
things, right?
The monkey
When
with
I
the
think
hand in his trap,
logically-
T-Frog.
By the way, most people don't think logically. Extensive psychological studies on this, and they get in a lot of trouble.
Okay, let
And
me
a lot
just
of
make
it.
this.
No shade on you,
Yeah,
but the more mysticogically you think,
yeah,
you tend to get in more trouble.
really.
Okay.
Okay.
Go to any charismatic church in your neighborhood, and you'll see people trying to get healed from cancer, people trying to get healed from diabetes.
I see
trying to
people at the hospital trying to
this
get
is-
healed from
this-
cancer.
But I have people. in my
Everybody wants to
family
be
that-
healed
this-
from
that-
cancer.
that survived cancer, not because they went to a charismatic
No,
church.
not all of them survive cancer, but they all
because they
hope
went to
to
a
be
hospital.
healed,
So,
just like
so
the ones in church.
science works. Mystagogical thinking doesn't work. It's
but
very
that
simple.
again, you're gonna have
Placebo
to
effect, T-Grog? You want placebo effect?
Oh, so medicine didn't. Vaccinations don't have anything to do with curing
Okay,
smallpox.
can I just
They
make
don't-
a little? I'm gonna.
That's
tell-
not my point. But the point is like you can't like
You guys are getting too
we've run this
excited.
objectivity experiment till its end, and it's about to destroy our civilization. So I think I think maybe it's time to let in some other possibilities.
I just
And
want
the
to
All these
say,
people
utilitarian
that run these
argument-
countries are Christians. They're professing Christians, guys.
And that's a
Except for
huge problem. And
China.
I think you've got your finger on a pulse of a deep hypocrisy within Christianity. That
The idea that
well, that's
You
the
think
whole
Joe Biden's
article
an
that Nate
atheist?
just read. That's the whole article Nate read. That's why he read it. That Christianity got us to this point.
Yeah.
That's what the article says.
It says, "Hey, Christianity got us here." That's
Like, we're not
one of
denying
the major
that.
points he's driving at.
But I would
the
like to
question of
say-
the defects in Christianity, like, you're not going to get much pushback from me on that. But what I'm pushing back for you is that the empirical sciences offer no significant salvation out of the barbarism of the prior age. They've only accelerated it. I mean,
Well,
we've got
it's-
benefits from it too.
And by the way, and it is, and the reason for that, Jed, is because if it works is all that matters, then the Nazis weren't wrong.
Well, I disagree with that because I think morality is a very difficult topic. Okay, it's very difficult even for Christians who's supposed to have an absolute morality. It's a very difficult topic. It deals with, and I would say that it's very amenable to current science or any science I can imagine, but it's based upon human feelings, the advancement of civilization. You know, Christians in the Middle Ages had no problem with slaving other people, serfdom, raping people, no problem whatsoever. Okay, burning down other cities and stuff. They had no problem with that whatsoever.
I don't think they have a problem with it today either, actually.
So my point is, it's kind of like a drug. You test the drug and you say, okay, we got this one group. So Christianity had control over vast swaths of the West and Byzantium for 1,000 years or more. And what do you have? Peace and happiness?
In comparison to what came before it, yes.
But that's not the point. The point is,
we also got universities and hospitals and charitable organizations, and also the church. The church often played a role in resisting the barbarisms of the state.
Well, that's a historical argument. I'm reading
religious orders that were working in the Americas. Resisting the ravages of the Spanish government against the native peoples. Christianity never has fully become what it is called to be, but it still was acting as a counterbalancing force to everything that came before.
There were always nice people in every culture, okay? And they had a conscience, and they said, oh, look, this person's suffering, and I suffer too, and I don't want them to suffer. I understand that. The problem is, if Christianity was just some religion, simple, that'd be fine. But Christianity claims to have the omnipotent power of the Holy Spirit of God, the third person of the Trinity, changing Christians and making them a new creation. Where is it? Where is it?
Usually in the prayer rooms of grandmothers.
Yeah, where is it?
It's in the prayer rooms of grandmothers.
That's not the guy.
World War One was.
We're talking about it's the fact that you immediately go to omnipotent power.
Yeah.
To me, suggests that you're talking about a God that I'm not talking about.
Right.
Well, you're all talking about different gods here, seemingly.
Yeah, well, I
think the one that you're talking about, T-Grog, is one that you're really not happy with. Like,
and
really.
I don't blame him. I don't like that God either.
I don't blame you either. And I would just suggest, like, here's a suggestion, that there is a different God out there. And I know him.
I understand that.
I know him, and
not the kind of historic Christianity.
And I'm just
that's a false claim. It's not the God of a particular form of historic Christianity that you were exposed to.
I wasn't finished speaking.
Go for it, Sherry.
I said there is another God, and I know him. And if you maybe could put down your weapons because you're angry.
I'm not angry, really.
No, this is the sense that I'm getting. I mean, no, you're not angry with me, and you're not angry in the conversation, and I'm not either. But I think that there is an underlying distrust, anger, disappointment, betrayal, whatever, I've got from the God that you know, right? And I'm just suggesting that maybe if you could, just listen, you might actually encounter the God that I know, or the God that Nate knows, or the God that Jed knows. And I think, yes, they're all different because we cannot possibly hold the same image in our minds. If we did, it would be an idol. Okay. So yeah, we need to be able to step in and out, which is what conversation is, of one another's consciousnesses, and understand the image of God that these people hold, right? And if they're good people, I think it's worth the effort.
I think you're very nice people. Nobody here, right in this chat right now, believes in eternal conscious torment. I don't think. So that's great. But I would just say this: it's such a vague, it's so vague that, I just don't.
Well, and I think some of the vagaries there,
I know
though.
what Peterson thinks now, but I hear Jonathan Peugeot going on and on and on about, and I'm like, I put in the Athanasian Creed in here somewhere a quote. This is the Catholic faith, which a man believe truly and firmly he cannot be saved. That's clear. That's clear. It's very clear.
I've never said that.
But even like, let's.
No, I'm just saying. I like clarity.
I've never said that though.
Right. So, and that's
but
where
Athanasius did.
Well, Athanasius didn't write the Athanasian Creed.
Well,
yeah, it's a forgery.
It's
a forgery.
But
only metaphorically.
Right. So I wanted to go back though and ask you a different question, and just this is not like necessarily a pointed question towards or away from theism as much as I'm just curious. So you had talked about like at one point like your love and your care for, I think it was your daughter, and then if you have a stroke you might feel differently.
Yes.
So what you're describing to me there is, it seems like there's a sense where your love for or aversion to something is an epiphenomenal reality that can be changed.
I don't believe that you have any experiences outside without a brain.
All right. So, okay. And just granting that for argument's sake, then like what would keep you, what keeps us in like within relationships, through the dynamics of change, through changing brain states then?
That's a very good question. I'd have to, I'm not familiar with the literature enough to actually say. I would hypothesize that you form connections and bonding through neurohormonal changes in your brain with people. And that's what we label as love. And, but it can change. My father-in-law died of Alzheimer's, and his demeanor and emotions took radically different directions as it progressed.
Did you without interrogating that too much, would you say that your own personal feelings towards your father changed as the
it was my father-in-law.
Oh, your father-in-law. Okay.
Yeah.
And I don't know any history there, so I'm not trying to probe too much, but would you say like your fundamental sentiments towards your father-in-law changed?
Well, he's dying of Alzheimer's, so you just say, well, he's got Alzheimer's. So, what do you expect?
But do you think he's less of a person because of the Alzheimer's?
I think, the whole idea of personhood is a very interesting idea. Too little time, too many books, too many questions. What is a person? What makes up a person? I would say their memories, their personality. Was my father-in-law the same person when he died than when he was 50? I don't think so.
Okay.
How could you say he's the same person? He's trying to grab my daughter's ass and, he's doing crazy stuff. He's talking to himself in the mirror. He said, I made a new friend. He's talking to himself in the mirror.
Right. Okay. Well, then
he doesn't recognize himself.
Right. So then I guess my secondary question, and this is just more for my own clarification, if we go into like different fields of consciousness studies from people who are not necessarily theistic in their orientation, I would think here like guys like David Chalmers and other guys studying consciousness that would argue on the basis of science that we cannot reduce those experiences or the reality of consciousness to brain states. What would you say to just in the scientific domain of arguments against materialism?
It's a very difficult problem. I would say that if you look at Phil papers, they do surveys here of philosophers. The vast majority of philosophers are naturalists. It's a huge problem because the brain is extremely complicated. It's more complicated than anything else we know in the whole universe. So it's a very difficult problem. I think experimental psychology, what's it been around since 1830? Give it time. I don't.
Well, it's so interesting because I feel like that goes. There's in a sense in that implicit in that statement is the same kind of teleological hope that Christianity pins its ultimate arguments on. Give it time.
Well, yeah, I understand that, but the Christians have had they've had thousands of years. I mean, experimental psychology, like I said, has been around since what, 1830, 1840? I mean, that's not a lot of time.
Okay.
I would say this, a great book that I read, which I recommend to anyone, is called The Ego Tunnel by Thomas Metzinger. He's an experimental philosopher.
Okay.
An experimental philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about that consciousness and personality, it's a program that's running inside your brain, and gives experimental results. How we can, like for example, simulate out-of-body experiences very easily in the lab, very easily. And yeah, see, I like, I'm trying to understand this stuff. It's so complicated. I don't claim to understand it. Don't claim to be an expert on anything.
Okay.
But I think that, and now getting back to Hoffman and I find that Christians hook onto these gurus like Tom Holland, for example, who's not a historian of the ancient world. He's not a historian. He has no credentials in history whatsoever. Yeah, he's a popularizer.
Right.
And they hook onto these people and say, see, which is fine. Everybody does that. Look, I'm an atheist. I read books by atheists.
Right.
Book by atheists. All that. David Bentley Hart, I could never read a book by him because he's so wordy. But there's a lot of unsolved problems. There's a lot of mysteries in the world. I'm not saying the world and the universe is not a mysterious place, and it's very strange that you're here and you exist. That, of course, that's very strange.
Then I want to ask you then,
Sure.
if that's the case, if it's very, very strange and very mysterious, what if the Christian story is true?
Well, that's why I'm here.
Okay.
I'm listening to what you guys have to say, and I'm trying to, everybody's on a journey. Maybe Judaism's true. Maybe Hare Krishna is true.
Well,
Maybe Mormonism is true.
There's nothing particularly controversial or popularizing or unsound about Holland's thesis about what the value system of classical antiquity was. It's pretty much it's pretty much there for anyone who actually goes and reads.
Yeah, I mean, we've read Homer.
Well, yeah, Homer's incredibly violent. These people are coming Neolithic age, people are incredibly violent in general when you're competing for scarce resources. You guys have a window. If civilization collapses, Christianity will come back in a very virulent form, just like the Roman Catholic Church during the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages. It'll come back because people need comfort. They need reassurance. It's an emotional thing. There's no reality beyond that. It's an emotional thing. God's got everything under control, guys. Everything's going to be okay.
Well,
you're part of the
it's-
elect. You're part of the chosen group.
See, but
Right, but that's still constricting a definition that's saying that that reality can be fully experienced or interpreted empirically. And I think, the vast majority of the world's population are not atheists or materialists.
I understand that.
Right. So I think that the idea that so here's how I would problematize the materialist position is I think that in some senses it arises out of a deep dissatisfaction of the internal contradictions that are certainly there within Christianity. They're really there. So when you're pointing out, hey, there's this problem with Christianity, that problem. Yes. I don't disagree with you necessarily, at least in the broadest sense. Right. But I don't think that what it's offering is ultimately anything particularly better, right? Because what we're facing right now, we have all these moral, ethical, social problems, but if we just look at the technologies that science has produced, could become the very instruments through which we destroy ourselves. And so these are produced empirically, they're by generally probably fairly moral people, right? So it's not even the problem of morality gets
by
very
theists.
complicated. Right. So I just don't think that I don't think that it's, the idea that the scientific materialistic worldview is offering us something that's significantly better. It's just okay, even based on its own principles, where's the beef? And that piece, that's an honest question.
Well, I just want to thank you guys with all due respect. For letting me on this stream. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's awesome.
You've been very gracious. You're very nice. I appreciate it. I'm, certainly, I don't claim to know everything. And, but I've been burned so bad by, that's why I'm suspicious of Tom Holland, by the way, because these things that people hook onto, these popularizations and by a guy who's not really an ancient historian. He's really not. So I'm very suspicious of that, extremely suspicious, because there's a lot of Christians and you could sell a hell of a lot more books than writing a book about atheism. Okay. So you can make a lot of money in Christianity. There's big money to be made there. Okay. So
Nate and I have been talking
but Tigrog, to be fair, Tom Holland was an atheist and didn't anticipate writing the book he ended up writing.
Well, that's what he says. Yeah. I don't know all the backstory of Tom Holland, but he's not an ancient historian. He's a popularizer and he writes popular books, and I understand that. And I'm trying to go through it. And I think, I think some of the things he says, it's more like by omission. In other words, he's talking about Origen, how Origen was considered to be a heretic and condemned at several councils. Council. The idea that he's a Christian writer, well, the vast majority of the church rejected Origen, rejected him.
That's a thorny
quite
subject.
Accurate.
That's a total different. Yeah.
So he wasn't condemned at councils?
He was condemned to the Fifth Ecumenical Council, and the church was wrong for doing so.
His teaching was condemned.
Yeah.
But they were.
Okay.
It was 300 years later, and there was a group of people
Yeah.
called Origenists, and they had a different take on his teaching. So, anyways, it's a very complicated
The church was very uncharitable toward Origen, given that Origen was the very first person in history who was doing speculative theology, and Origen was very clear about saying, I might be getting some things wrong, and did not think that and realized that what he was doing was in the realm of speculation. And the church was very uncharitable because a lot of Origenists, as Sherry pointed out, took Origen and to extremes. So, yeah.
Chad, what's up, dude?
Well, see, I don't see them with councils then. Right? It's just humans working stuff out. There's no divine influence there that's discernible. So
well, but we're Christians, so to say that it's human, and therefore it's just human is fundamentally not a very Christian thing to do, because we believe in the God that is revealed in Jesus Christ, who is both fully human and divine. So that which is human is also divine.
Well, so you believe every human is divine, like Jesus was?
Every human being is created in the image of God.
Yeah, but you don't.
You are in the process. You are in the process. You are in the process of being made like Him. Yes. Unless you want to reject the working of that process in you.
Well, I don't think that comports with any creedal formulation I've ever seen. I mean, what's your basis for that? Is that?
Well, go and watch my back catalog.
Yeah, so that would seem to make everybody's the second person of the Trinity. Is that what you're saying?
The life we are being called into is participation in the perichoresis of the divine Trinity itself. Yes.
Yeah, there's a thing Leibniz came up with it, the indiscernibility of identicals. So if Jesus is this way and we're this way, we're the same as Jesus, right? Is that Christianity?
Yes.
His humanity is our humanity. There's no other humanity.
Well, I understand that, but that doesn't mean every single person is Jesus, right?
We're called the body of Christ. So I think that makes us Jesus.
So was Judas part of the body of Christ?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think. Yeah,
go back and look at my reading of the Edwin Muir poem Transfiguration.
He gave him communion.
Is this thing just not working? I imagine.
No, I can hear you, Chad.
Okay. All right.
Well, that's a unique interpretation. Okay. I've never heard that before.
Yeah. I'm seeing that on your face. You're like, what?
That's.
I should read. I feel like reading Transfiguration right now, but I want to hear Chad talk.
Yeah.
Well, I can only speak from my own experience, obviously, which is probably annoying to. Is your name Tom or T. Grog? It's a pleasure to get to talk with you. I have the same suspicion, first of all, around especially right now. There's all these celebrities coming out as Christian, and I have a very high degree of suspicion around that. Much the same that you're saying, here's Tom Holland. He can, grift and sell this book to a bunch of Christians rather than atheists. So I get that sentiment. I really do. But I also, I can't. When you were talking about this religiosity, or let's say when people have their conversion as merely comfort or emotionalism, I have to wholeheartedly disagree, because I wasn't looking to become a Christian, and what ended up happening was, and I'm very leery of using this phrase of I'm a Christian. First of all, I'm not smart enough to discern whether or not it's wise to call myself that, but a big piece of this was I wasn't looking for it, and it was placed upon me, and now I have to deal with it. Now that wasn't something that was emotional. It wasn't something. It's also something that I can't explain. So that it becomes very difficult. So is that imagination? Or is it reality? And that's very strange to me, because I actually think we've denigrated the idea of imagination, or we've reduced it down to something as simple as um, like this, like this word that we're using, imagination. It's like it's an imaginary thing, therefore it isn't real. It's like I can remember my grandmother's face right now. Is that imagination or is that real? And so there's that. And then this thing about Judas. I mean, I've thought a lot about that too, but if there's no Judas, there's no crucifixion, there's no resurrection, there's no ascension, there's no, so that's all kind of goofy. And I know that you are a lot more read than I am. I just found for myself, the closer I move towards the flame of trying to tie down the answer, the more pulled apart I become, and the less connected I become to my fellows. And I'm a very suspicious person, so it's difficult. But I'm glad that you're here. And what I love what you're doing is you're giving us a lot of good stuff to think about, and this is good because it kind of stops us from talking about ourselves like a bunch of wackadoodles. So thanks for that. I got to roll. Bye.
Bye, Chad.
Bye.
Love you, brother.
I have a question about Hal Lindsey.
Yeah.
So, like,
I know
what makes Hal Lindsey different than Richard Dawkins?
Well, you mean are you talking to me or do you want the other
Yeah,
people?
yeah.
Well, Hal Lindsey made testable predictions in the late great planet Earth, which was responsible for my conversion. And he said that, the world was going to end by 1988. I said 1984 in another live stream. That was a mistake. And the world didn't end in 1988. Unless you want to say it ended metaphorically.
Well, it's because Dukakis didn't end up.
Yeah, you could say it ended metaphorically, right? I mean,
Did your world end? Did your world end?
There was some.
Did your world
something
end
happened
in
that I'm not
1988?
aware of that it metaphorically ended. So
Did your world end in 1988?
it didn't end, so the prediction's falsified. Now,
No, but did your world, like your world that you were living in, psychologically end in 1988?
I left Christianity before that.
Okay.
I left Christianity probably in 1984 after I paid a friend of mine to write an apologetics book against atheists. Yeah. Which was full of errors and falsehoods. Let's put it that way.
So that psychologically is that's like a betrayal. Like you were betrayed by that.
When people who are Christians lie, yeah, that doesn't.
No, but that guy betrayed your
confidence.
trust. That guy betrayed your trust because you gave him money to do something that you believed in.
Yeah, but I don't look at it that way. I look at it like, if this is the best somebody can do to defend Christianity, this
is that how you?
False.
So that was the turning point for you was funding that book and then that being a poor apologetic.
Well, I think, as I recall, I have to go back now for a long time. As I recall, I was reading atheist books and books like by David Friedrich Strauss, Life of Jesus Critically Examined, and I found enormous clarity and logic in their arguments, unlike Christian arguments, which tend to be muddled and imprecise and contrafactual. So
what were the facts that you felt like you understood that really got to you?
Well, like the Earth's billions of years old, for one thing.
Okay, so the breakdown of young Earth.
And the Earth is very old, and that there's tremendous evidence that we evolved from lower organisms, and that the narrative of Genesis is based upon older ancient Near Eastern texts that are mythological. Things like that.
At this point in history, do you feel like the scientific enterprise is building its own myth.
Is Hezi still out there? I would love to hear. Like, this is where I would like to invite Hezi in to speak to the nature of the Hebrew scriptures.
Science is imperfect. It's a human endeavor. It's a way of knowing things. It's not perfect. It doesn't claim to be perfect. It doesn't claim to be inspired by a god.
What does
So,
it
of
not?
course-
What does it?
of
What
course-
does it
of-
not do?
Of course, there are going to be problems with it, but we've made enormous advances in human longevity, elimination of suffering, disease, death, leprosy, smallpox, polio. So I say, if you want to ditch science, that's fine. Don't go to the doctor anymore. Don't take vaccines. Don't go, if you get cancer, go to a healing service. That's fine. But I don't think it's an optimal choice.
Who's
I
talking
wouldn't do
about
it.
who's talking about ditching science though?
Well, this disparagement of science that I see with Christians. Well, science can't answer all the questions, therefore whatever.
I'm just saying, why can't it be both?
I would say,
why does it have to be one of? Why does it have to be one or the other?
I'm actually very suspicious of anything answering all questions.
Well, yeah, you should.
Right, including science.
I think good.
And I've actually seen scientists becoming priests, people saying they believe in science. Like, science has now taken on this
scientists are people too.
The mantle of religion for people. Like, people have put their faith in science. Like, and that's disturbing. That's equally disturbing to me. So,
well, I think I reject the idea of faith in toto as a way of knowing anything.
Oh, faith is how you know anything. You can't know anything without faith.
In
fact, when you admitted that we can't, that certainty is not on the table, you implicitly admitted that.
okay,
Well, it depends on what you mean by faith, right? No Christians can agree on what faith means.
Well, you have to.
Yeah.
I'll go back to the illustration you used. Your relationship with the coffee cup that you trust. You trust that this coffee cup is here in your hand, that you're able to drink it.
Well,
your relationship with that coffee cup is established on faith.
My faith in this coffee cup is a little bit different than my faith in Vishnu.
In what?
I can touch the coffee cup. I can touch Vishnu or any other god. I can touch the coffee cup. I can weigh it. I can determine its mass. I could determine its composition. It's a little different, right?
Right. So matter is the only thing that you trust.
Well, I'm just saying we have more these other things. This is a problem, and I've raised this before in these streams. If your epistemological stance is you cannot determine what is real and what is imaginary, you got a big problem.
Oh, that's a fun one. You've just opened up a big.
Yeah. and you know what? I actually.
So let me.
I have to go.
With that
I have
one real
to
quick.
go. I just want to say.
Well, let's invite Tigrog to come back anytime. You have an open invitation. You're always.
Well, I
open
appreciate it.
This
I appreciate all of you.
Let's keep the dialogue going. And
go for it, you guys. Don't. I
appreciate all of you.
I gotta feed my animals, so I'm gonna.
I understand. Animals are important. I used to have chickens, dear. So, Araucana chickens.
Take care of your farm, Sherry. We love you.
Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Sherry. So I want to play some devil's advocate here with my atheist friend on the question of imagination, because I think imagination actually makes things real. And I'll use an example. All right. So I love the fiction of Jules Verne, probably the first fictional author that begins to play with the idea that we're going to travel to other worlds. Right. And first fictional author I can think of that deals with space travel, those kinds of things. I would say that was absolutely a necessary step in our progression to eventually launching rockets into space. somebody had to imagine the possibility before science could go and then actualize that possibility in some way. So I think sometimes the imagination, like these imaginative leaps, whether that's, and I think that is underneath even like Einstein, the way he was getting his insights were not necessarily through a logical process, but through this kind of recursive relationship with imagination, ideas, and trying to see if he could make the math pencil out, essentially. Like, so I think that the imagination is actually maybe a little more foundational and fundamental than it would appear at first blush, even from a scientific framework, right? Like we had Dick Tracy in his little watch, and now we've got, Apple Watches, right? So somebody thought of this idea of in a fictional context, and then all of a sudden says, hey, I think I can make that work in reality. And I think that it's the imagination that precedes the science in that sense.
Of course, that makes perfect sense. But you got a reality test. Einstein's theories, if they were just his imagination and they didn't pan out in reality, they would.
There was some correspondence to reality there. I agree. But
I mean, I can imagine a 900-pound diamond in my backyard, right? And it makes me feel really good to really imagine that. And I go, wow, I'm rich now.
You just need to imagine.
It ain't real, man. Yeah, right. Well, that's the new age thing. If you imagine it, if you believe, you will achieve and you will receive, right? MLM, baby.
Yeah.
Yeah, I live in Mormonville, and the problem is these folks are all they're open to all these scams because they go by imagination and feeling. See, imagine yourself on a yacht in the Mediterranean. Imagine yourself doing this. It's bad.
I think that's where like it's an unchained dialectic at that point. I look at kind of the productive ability of the imagination has to be counterbalanced with rational thinking. Like they both kind of need each other. And so you can imagine possibilities, but then you have to have, I work in a business context. And so I've got to have the finance department telling me, yeah, this is realistic, or no, this is not realistic based on current resource constraints.
I couldn't agree more.
Right.
I think that, look, I'm not against imagination. Mm-hmm. I don't read a lot of fiction, at least not that I think it's fiction, but I don't read a lot of fiction. But it's beautiful. The Lord of the Rings, beautiful. Shakespeare, beautiful. Michelangelo creates beautiful art. I mean, it's beautiful, but it's a different thing than what we're talking about here. I'm trying to figure out what is like real, okay? And like real, like, is there life after death? Was there a person named Jesus who is the second person of the Trinity, who proceeds eternally from God the Father? What's the evidence for these claims? What does it mean to say? See, I think, I think you guys are going the right way with Christianity because, if you say, well, there was an Adam and Eve 6,000 years ago in the Garden of Eden, and see, that's readily falsifiable. Mm-hmm. This other stuff, you can't falsify it. There's no way to falsify it.
Right.
I had an encounter with God. I had an encounter with Jesus. Okay.
Yeah. And so I think, I come out of that. I was raised with mailers from Institution of Creation Research and went down to the museums down here. I live in San Diego area.
Yeah, of course.
I was raised in that context. And what I found is that their very efforts to preserve the faith within the constraints of a scientific frame of reference actually ends up destroying it.
That's correct. It did for me.
Yeah. And I think that, like, for me, what moved me out of that was maybe as opposed to saying, like, I'm leaving behind one set of discrete facts for a different understanding of the factual basis of reality, was like that deeper sense of that personal encounter. Right. And that was what drove me. And I think I find it to be very reasonable for people to, like, in some sense, I find it, laudable to leave that mode of faith, because I don't think that it ultimately holds up.
But not everything that is real can be weighed and measured and quantified.
No, and
That's
I
the
don't think so.
problem.
But I think that it's presented.
I would say that. I would say, as a physicalist, I would say that things that you can't measure and quantify are the physical supervenes on that. In other words,
Okay.
the feeling of love I have for my daughter, or the feeling of feeling of mirth when I see something funny or something like that. Yeah, I understand that. But if I didn't have a brain, I wouldn't be feeling mirth or anything else.
Yeah, and I get those arguments. I mean, I don't find them persuasive even on their own terms, because I think that there's good scientific argumentation that would argue against
actually, like, even within scientific circles, the idea that thought is completely dependent upon the brain is not even fully accepted anymore. Like, that's not, like, even scientists challenge that kind of thinking, that kind of reductive materialism.
Well, yeah,
is not even in vogue in the sciences anymore.
If you can find a way to test that, sure. I'll give you an example. We should predict that when I go under general anesthesia and I'm close to death, by the way, people are in a kind of a state of suspended animation and major surgery, that your soul should be fully conscious and you're looking around the room, but most of the time.
But Seagrog, let's talk about something like the principles of mathematics, which you said were invented and not discovered, right?
Yes, they're invented.
So
it's a language like German.
So if they only exist in human brains, why do they persist over time?
Well, they persist because they're human brains to think about them. I don't think that mathematics existed 14.
But why would we expect? Why would we expect to act like? Why would we have any? If they were simply invented by us, why would we have any reasonable expectation to find them corresponding to observable reality?
Because we observe reality, and we observed it for a long, long, long time. And then we created normalization of what we actually see and experience.
So wouldn't that suggest that rather than saying that mathematics were something that we invented, that it's something that we intuited from our long observations of reality over evolutionary history, something that we intuited, and that at some point in our development we were able to articulate it into what became our mathematics. So in which case the mathematics actually is something that we genuinely observed in the structure of reality.
Well, yeah, in other words, you could say that humans figured out that a reality has a mathematical structure. Now, there are alternate mathematical forms. For example, Immanuel Kant thought that Euclidean geometry was obviously, the way the world was. Now we know that there are alternate ways of describing geometry than Euclid. Okay,
like Mandelbrot and these
humans invented that. Okay, they invented it, right? And
did we invent it, or did we have did new intuitions become articulable?
So, well, and can I back into that question with just something related? Would you say that we invented like logical or rational thinking as well? Oh, he's on the phone. Oh, sorry. Do you think that, like, similar to, like, just in terms of linguistically, like if we're granting that mathematics is a language, is logic a language as well that we invented?
Yeah, I don't want to play Tom Holland here. I'm not the world expert on all these topics. Okay. I don't know everything about all these topics. This is what I have come to in my own personal conclusions. I'm not saying they're gospel, written in stone. I find the idea of a Platonic realm of numbers to be very weird and strange. Okay. And I find the naturalist, I like to explain, I find naturalism compelling because naturalism in all the history of science, all we find is naturalism, naturalistic explanations. We don't find supernaturalistic things going on, right?
Could that be confirmation bias?
Yeah, well, I'm just saying that we don't see it. We don't see people who have amputated limbs grow them back because they pray to Jesus. We don't see things like that. So there might be a supernatural. There might be. It's possible. I just don't see any evidence. And what I see is, when I look at the history of the supernatural and supernaturalistic explanations, I see lies, superstition, scams, money-making mongers, and crap like that. That's what I see. So I just don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess
and like citing the church fathers were products of their age. They're superstitious. They believe all sorts of crazy stuff, is bogus.
We believe all kinds of crazy stuff.
Well, I understand that. But you have to understand the world they came from was full of demons and supernatural entities, and nobody knew how anything worked.
Yeah.
Why, how is demons an inferior explanation to psychosis?
We can treat. Well, that's a good question.
And people cast out demons. People cast out demons before we had psychology too.
Yeah, but
and it also worked, by the way. If we want to go with your "it worked" pragmatic model.
Well, I that's a hypothesis. I'd like to see.
It's not a hypothesis. We actually can go back and read the accounts of people being delivered from demons.
Okay, it's an account.
And so is a log of psychological treatment. It's just an account.
It's not a controlled experiment. You have to have controls on these things. Accounts are just accounts. There's accounts. You read enough history, man. There's accounts of all sorts of crazy stuff. Read the life of Saint Anthony of the Desert. There's all sorts of bizarre accounts out there. Okay.
Yeah, so I'll tell you what's crazy. Here's the thing, St. Grog, this is one of the things that's crazy about our age, is that we refuse to believe the accounts of people we otherwise know to be sane and acting in good faith because it doesn't fit our paradigm.
That's a hypothesis that they're acting in good faith. Look at the TV preachers nowadays. Are they acting in good faith?
No, and I think that's a reasonable. I honestly do think that that's a very reasonable argument against. But I would say, are the televangelist musings of a guy like Joel Osteen comparable to the theological writings of Gregory of Nyssa? And I just don't see them even playing.
Well, Gregory's smarter. That's for sure.
And I don't think he's trying to hawk anything. Right. I don't think that there's.
As far as we know, he's not trying to hawk anything.
I would say a guy who's writing against slavery in a time where the rest of the world.
When no one else had ever thought to do it.
Right. So I think that and it's not to say that they don't have clay feet, because they all do, because we all do. Right. But I think there's a difference between being an outright charlatan, which, I would say I'd be comfortable saying I feel like Joel Osteen is, versus somebody who is from a different time, and I may have different points of disagreement. I don't entirely think that Nyss's cosmology is, current, right? But I don't think that he was operating in bad faith. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's entirely possible. He came from an ignorant and barbarous age. And
if you've read his On the Making of Man, he models this after the Timaeus and Plato. I would say that it's probably ignorant. It depends on what you mean by that, because I think
I would say that a comparison
pretty scientific.
I would say that in many ways, modernity is barbarous in comparison to classical antiquity. Just as, by the way, we would find some of the morals of classical antiquity barbarous from our perspective because we live in the shadow of Christianity.
Listen, I can tell you this: Christian nations have unleashed a lot of barbarism. It's just we don't look at it that way. You know, firebombing of Dresden, firebombing of Tokyo.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty barbaric. And we have the technology.
Right, but you're using but you're using a Christian lens in order to make that critique, T-Grog.
But these are Christian countries that are doing this. This is
right, exactly. But without reference to Christian principles, you can't even make that critique.
Oh, I disagree. I think I would say if you look at comparative moral,
no one could have made that. No one could have made a similar critique over Julius Caesar's actions in Gaul, and anybody who did so would have been laughed at.
Well, that's Tom Holland's take on it.
It's not just Tom Holland's. David Bentley Hart has the same take in an essay from 2003 before Tom Holland ever had any thought of writing Dominion. Like anyone who's ever studied classics with any seriousness will tell you the same thing.
If you read history, you'll find that historians don't agree on all these things, okay? And people have a take. Well, of course, you know, for the Christians, classical antiquity was horrible. I mean, because it wasn't Christian, right? We have by the way, most literature from classical antiquity, because it was either destroyed or lost, 90%, 95%. So what do we really know about classical antiquity? Not much.
We know quite a lot.
What do we know about these people? What do we know about these people? Gregory of Nyssa. What do we know about Paul? What do we actually know about these people? I think of a guy, and you guys probably aren't familiar with him, Ravi Zacharias. Ravi Zacharias was a world-famous apologist, running around telling everybody that all these wretched heathens and atheists don't have any morality. The guy is a total degenerate, okay?
Mm-hmm.
He's a total degenerate. So we know a lot more about Ravi than we do about Gregory of Nyssa or Augustine, or we just don't know much about the past. That's my hypothesis. We don't know a lot. We've lost a lot, and it's in the past, so it's a big problem.
Well,
we just don't know.
Well, you don't know a lot about the past. Perhaps, maybe you don't know a lot about the past, but this is because of the tendency of modernity, which C.S. Lewis was fond of pointing out, which is that we don't like to read old books.
I read a lot of old books, actually.
Tigger, I gotta say, like you're like the come in here and your idea of Christian theology is entirely based upon a 500-year window of Christian theology. And it completely discards everything before that 500-year window.
What 500-year window is that?
Post-Reformation.
Yeah. Like, I mean, that's
not true. I read the Catholic creeds.
Right, but you're reading that from a
council.
Yeah, but you're reading it through a very evangelical, dispensationalist, like post-1840 kind of theological lens, which is not your fault. That is the cultural heritage that as a North American person born in the 20th century, that's your heritage. And I'm not blaming you for that, but you have to there are other perspectives within the history of Christianity other than that one.
Well, of course there are, because it's a mess. It's complete confusion.
Right.
Yeah, of course there are other perspectives because they can't agree on anything.
Right. So you're putting me in the awkward position. Like a lot of times it's like when you're talking about Christianity, it's like I don't recognize that as Christianity any more than you do. You know what I'm saying?
Person has got
so you're putting me in a position of defending something that I have no desire to defend because it's not what I believe.
Well, yeah, because Christians can't agree on anything. I understand.
Well, people can't agree on anything.
True.
Republicans can't agree on anything. Democrats can't agree on anything.
Well, yeah, but for divine revelation, I would think that some people could figure out what the hell's going on.
Well,
that seems to be a reasonable hypothesis.
Once again, though, you have multiple interpretations of what the hell's going on within science. Like, I mean, there's some of this.
That's true, but we do have ways to test them.
We do, but there's still, even within those fields, like you're still going to bring in the subjective perspectives of the people who are the observer is always a part of the experiment, and that's
my problem. This is the nebula problem, and then I got to go. How does your position not collapse into radical relativism and solipsism?
That's a good
In
question.
other words,
Mm-hmm.
I have an experience of God, and this is my Christianity. See,
Mm-hmm.
okay, and God told me this. See, and this is the way I see it. I see this as a metaphor. I see this as real. I see this as this. This is that, and it's all
right. So I mean,
it's all up for grabs, right?
well, for me, there's a lot. I would answer that in a couple of ways.
Solipsism and skepticism.
Right. So for me, there's a
that's the
lot
end
that's
point.
up for grabs. I think we can even, materialists can agree that there was a man named Jesus that was crucified in Palestine, roughly AD 33. Right.
Yeah, I would.
Most
say
people would agree that. I mean, there's some
seems
people
to
who
be.
dispute that.
Yeah, that
However,
seems.
like
Now
everything,
we could dig up evidence next week that
sure, but
shows
sure.
something else. But
sure, and that's fine. But I would say, like,
it's tentative.
I do see God's self-disclosure in the person of Jesus Christ as the fundamental sine qua non revelatory act in human history. To me, beyond that, almost everything else is up for grabs.
And so yeah.
And so I don't get too ruffled about questions of science. I don't get too ruffled about questions of, is this heresy or is this orthodoxy? To me, it is about what God is revealing about himself on the cross, right?
Who do you say I am?
Yeah, and so that to me
that's the fundamental question.
That's the most fundamental. Everything else is like negotiable for me, and I know that's probably not a typical Christian answer, but that would be. So the cross is the axis mundi, the still point around which the world revolves, in my thinking, right? Beyond that, there is a sense of relativity to the rest of it. It's relative to that still point. And beyond it, yeah, there is a certain element of relativity. Now, there's different overlays and lenses that you can look at reality through. And I find the empirical lens to be a beneficial and necessary lens. But again, it's not the full view, because you're going to have to open up different window to see reality in different ways. And so it's one aperture through which reality is viewed that yields certain very promising and helpful results. But it's still, there's still limitations to what the materialist or the empirical frame of reference can ultimately yield about uncovering the nature of reality. It's an important process. I just don't think that it's
ultimately it's a question. It's a question of authority, and it's a question of authority, and it's a question of authority and distinguishing authority from power too, which is why I object to that it works paradigm, because the it works paradigm is what does it do for me? It's a what does it do for me paradigm, and that is a dangerous truth paradigm for obvious reasons, because that's what leads to nihilism.
My gracious Christian hosts and friends, I'll let you have the last word.
No, that's fine. I don't need the last word.
And I just, I appreciate letting me in here, and it was fun. And maybe we'll do it again.
Yeah, it's very fun. T-Grog, you're awesome. I really enjoy. I want to let you know I really enjoy you. I think you're a great person, and I'm sure that a lot of what I say just sounds like crazy talk to you, and that's fine. It would have sounded like crazy talk to me 10, 20 years ago. So
yeah, ditto. I think you're very nice people, and you represent the best of what I would say Christians are. So
well, that's high praise.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate this discussion. It's been a blast.
God bless you, and he loves you whether you believe in him or not. All right, Mitch, did you have anything to say, or are you just hanging?
I felt like along the way, you guys had such a rhythm going, so I didn't want to interrupt it. But there was so much of interest to me that I couldn't keep up. I didn't feel it would be appropriate to interject at the time, so I don't have any regrets about that.
Well,
But,
I've enjoyed hearing your child in the background a few times. I love this. I love the sound of small children. It's wonderful.
yeah,
It's
she's
joyful.
happy today.
Yeah.
So,
Well, thank you for blessing us with the sounds of your child from time to time, even though you didn't say much.
my pleasure.
But I think I'm going to end the stream for this morning. Jed, thanks for joining us today. Peace out, everybody.
Take care.
Have a blessed day.
You too.